After my cheating wife left me and destroyed my business, I drove Uber to survive. One passenger, a dying old man, said, "You remind me of someone I lost." He tipped $30,000 and left his card. The next day, his lawyer called. "He died last night, but changed his will because of you." The inheritance was $89 million. But the lawyer's next sentence: "The reason the old man chose me made me cry." Look, I'm not saying I hit rock bottom. I'm saying rock bottom hit me first, then charged me interest. If desperation had a signature scent, it would be a toxic blend of 3-day-old McDonald's fries fossilizing under the passenger seat, mixed with that god-awful new car smell, air freshener dangling from my rearview mirror like a little tree of lies. That's what my 2015 Honda Civic smelled like these days, and honestly, it was a pretty accurate representation of my entire existence after Miranda decided to take a wrecking ball to our life together. We'd built Greendale landscapes from the ground up, and when I say we, I mean I broke my back doing actual landscaping work while she schmoozed clients over overpriced lattes and talked about synergy like it was a real thing normal humans cared about. She was the face, I was the hands, knees, and occasionally the guy who got poison ivy in places I'm not comfortable discussing. For 5 years, it worked. We were a team. We were partners. We were also, apparently, a tragic setup for the world's most predictable country song, because she didn't just leave me. She left me for my business partner, Doug. Yeah, Doug. The same Doug who wore cargo shorts to client meetings and thought business casual meant tucking in his Metallica t-shirt. She handled clients, all right. She handled Doug too. Literally. In our office. On the desk where we used to plan our futures and eat sad desk lunches together. When I found out, I didn't even get to do the whole dramatic confrontation thing, because by the time I pieced it together, she'd already consulted with a lawyer, frozen our joint accounts, and somehow convinced our actual clients that I was the toxic one holding the business back. Within 6 months, I lost the house, the one with the garden I'd personally designed, which felt like the universe had a real sick sense of irony. I lost the company I'd built with my own bleeding hands. I lost the marriage I thought was solid enough to weather anything except, apparently, Doug's persistent texting and his dumb beard. Oh, and the dog. Let's talk about the dog. Even Biscuit, our golden retriever who I'd rescued from a shelter and loved like a child, ran away 2 weeks after Miranda moved out. I'm not kidding when I say that dog looked guilty when I came home one day and found the back gate open. There were muddy paw prints leading away from the yard like some kind of canine prison break, and I swear to God, if dogs could leave notes, his would have said, "Sorry bro, but the vibes here are terrible and I'm out." I spent 3 days posting flyers, checking shelters, and calling his name in parks like a lunatic, but Biscuit had clearly decided that whatever life awaited him on the streets was preferable to watching me ugly cry in his cereal bowls at 2 in the morning. So yeah, I became an Uber driver. Me, Liam Henley, the guy who once had business cards with embossed lettering and a website that didn't look like it was designed in 1997, was now driving strangers around Minneapolis while they ignored me and argued with their significant others on speakerphone. I had a PhD in bad luck and a minor in humiliation, and my office was now a Honda that smelled like regret and processed potatoes. My mornings started at 5:30 a.m., which is an ungodly hour that should be illegal in all 50 states. I'd park in the back corner of the Walmart parking lot on Lyndale Avenue, strategically positioning myself near the cart return so I could pretend I was there for a reason other than abject despair. I'd sip cold gas station coffee from a cracked thermos, because apparently I couldn't even afford the luxury of hot beverages anymore, and I'd stare at my phone, watching the little Uber requests pop up like tiny reminders that this was my life now. Sometimes I tell myself I was on a journey of self-discovery, which is what people say when they're too proud to admit they're just broke, exhausted, and one broken windshield wiper away from a complete psychological meltdown. The reality was simpler and significantly less Instagram-worthy. I was surviving, barely, one $5 ride at a time. I'd pick up nurses heading to early shifts, college kids stumbling home from parties they'd remember fondly in 10 years, and business travelers who treated me like I was part of the car's upholstery. Most people didn't even look at me. I was invisible, a ghost in a Honda, a nameless driver in a city full of people too busy checking their phones to notice the guy behind the wheel used to have dreams bigger than make rent this month. But here's the thing about life, and I mean this in the most cosmically ridiculous way possible. It's got a twisted sense of humor. Just when you think you've perfected the art of being invisible, just when you've resigned yourself to being that background character in everyone else's story, fate decides to tap you on the shoulder. And sometimes, fate wears a cashmere coat that probably costs more than your car's blue book value. I didn't know it that morning, sitting in that Walmart parking lot with my cold coffee and my wounded pride, but my life was about to get weird. Not good weird or bad weird, just profoundly, inexplicably, life-alteringly weird. The kind of weird that makes you question whether you're living in reality or if you've accidentally stumbled into some indie film where the universe is the director and apparently thinks plot twists are hilarious. My phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m. airport pickup. Terminal C to downtown Grandview Hotel. Fair estimate, $23. I accepted it because that's what you do when your checking account has 2 digits and one of them is a 0. I pulled out of that Walmart parking lot, windshield wipers squeaking against the drizzle that had started falling like the sky itself was depressed, and I drove toward the airport with absolutely no idea that I was about to meet a man who would change everything. But that's how the best stories start, isn't it? With cold coffee, a broken heart, and absolutely no clue that everything you thought you knew about your life was about to get turned upside down by an 80-something-year-old man who smelled like expensive cologne and looked at you like he'd been waiting his whole life to find you in the back of a Walmart parking lot at dawn. The rain that morning felt personal, like God had specifically selected my Honda out of every vehicle in Minneapolis and decided, yeah, that guy needs a little extra misery today. It wasn't the romantic movie kind of rain either. You know, the kind where beautiful people run through it while indie music plays and everything looks artistically melancholic. No, this was that spiteful, cold, gets into your bones kind of rain that makes you question every life decision that led you to being outside at 6 in the morning. The kind of rain that says, you thought yesterday was bad? Hold my beer. I pulled up to Terminal C at Minneapolis-St. Paul International, my windshield wipers doing that annoying thing where they screech like they're personally offended by moisture. The arrivals area was mostly empty except for a few exhausted-looking travelers dragging suitcases that had clearly been through more than one battle with airline baggage handlers. My phone showed the passenger's name, Vernon C. Pickup location marked. I scanned the curb, looking for someone who matched the generic profile picture in the app, which, let's be honest, could have been anyone from a college student to somebody's grandfather. Then I saw him, and I immediately knew this wasn't going to be a typical ride where I'd spend 20 minutes in silence while someone scrolled through TikTok in my back seat. Mr. Vernon Claiborne looked like he'd walked straight out of a Ralph Lauren catalog, circa 1985, except instead of modeling sweaters on a yacht, he was standing under the airport overhang, looking like money incarnate. We're talking 80-something years old, maybe older, the kind of age where you've stopped counting because numbers become irrelevant when you've got that much life experience etched into your face. He wore a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than I'd made in the last 3 months, a silk scarf that looked smoother than my entire existence, and shoes so polished I could see my reflection in them from 15 feet away. His hair was silver, perfectly combed, and he carried a leather briefcase that screamed, "I've closed deals that changed industries." He moved slowly, deliberately, like every step was calculated and measured. But when he spoke, his voice was sharp, cutting through the rain and the airport chaos like a knife through warm butter. "You're Liam?" he asked, already knowing the answer because my beat-up Honda with the Uber sticker was kind of a dead giveaway. "That's me," I said, popping the trunk. "Let me grab your bag, sir." "I've got it," he said, but not in a dismissive way. More like a man who'd spent his whole life refusing help because accepting it felt like admitting weakness. He placed his bag in the trunk with a precision that suggested he'd done this exact motion 10,000 times in his life, then settled into the back seat with a small grunt that old knees make when they're forced to bend at unnatural angles. I pulled away from the curb, merging into the light morning traffic heading downtown. The rain picked up, because of course it did. My wipers protested louder. The car smelled like old fries and now, faintly, like expensive cologne that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. "Rough weather," I said, Because that's what you say when you're an Uber driver and the silence feels too heavy. Weather talk. The universal language of people who don't know each other but are temporarily stuck together in a moving vehicle. He smiled, not the polite, dismissive smile people give service workers, but a real one, like I'd said something that actually registered in his brain. I've seen worse, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd lived through things that made a little rain look like a minor inconvenience. Try negotiating hostile corporate takeovers in the 80s during a thunderstorm when your competition is trying to literally steal your company out from under you. That's rough weather. I laughed because, honestly, what else are you supposed to do when an elderly businessman casually drops a line like that? Well, sir, the roughest weather I've dealt with lately is my ex-wife's lawyer, so I think you've still got me beat. He chuckled, a dry sound that suggested he'd heard every variation of divorce jokes humanity had to offer. Divorce, huh? Expensive business, that. You have no idea, I said, shaking my head as I merged onto I-35. Or maybe you do. You look like a man who's been through some things. Several things, he said, his tone shifting slightly, like we'd stumbled onto territory he didn't usually discuss with strangers. Most of them expensive in ways that have nothing to do with money. We drove in silence for a while after that, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are both thinking about their respective disasters, but don't quite know how to articulate them. The rain drummed on the roof. The highway stretched ahead, gray and endless. My GPS cheerfully informed me we'd arrive at the Grandview Hotel in 17 minutes, as if time meant anything when you're trapped in existential contemplation with a stranger who smells like he's worth millions. Then he broke the silence with a question that caught me completely off guard. What did you do before this? I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were sharp, intensely focused, like he wasn't just making small talk, but genuinely wanted to know. You mean before I became Minneapolis's most average Uber driver? Yes, before that. I sighed, because the answer required explaining a level of failure I usually tried to avoid discussing before 7 a.m. I owned a landscaping company. Built it from nothing. Well, built it with my wife, technically. Greendale Landscapes. We had 30 employees, contracts with some of the biggest properties in the Twin Cities, even did work for a few commercial developments. I was good at it too. Really good. Had this whole vision about sustainable urban landscaping, native plant integration, the whole environmentally conscious thing before it was trendy. Impressive, Vernon said, and he sounded like he meant it. Was impressive, I corrected. Past tense. Then my wife decided that our business partner Doug was more interesting than me, and apparently, sleeping with him meant she also got to sleep with my half of the company. She turned every client against me, convinced them I was difficult to work with, and by the time the lawyers finished bleeding me dry, I had nothing. No company, no house, no wife, and somehow, no dog either, because even Biscuit decided I was too depressing to be around. Vernon was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said something I didn't expect. So you're a survivor. I'm a guy driving strangers around in a car that smells like defeat, I said. Not sure that qualifies as surviving. It does, he said firmly. Survival isn't about winning. It's about still being here when everything's told you to quit. Trust me, I've watched empires crumble, including my own a few times. The people who survive aren't the smartest or the richest. They're the ones too stubborn to disappear. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kept driving, feeling like this random elderly passenger had somehow looked directly into my soul and decided to give it a pep talk. We talked more after that, about failure, ambition, business, and how the only thing faster than success is how quickly people vanish when you lose everything. He told me about building his pharmaceutical company in the 70s, about competitors who'd tried to destroy him, about regulatory battles and patent wars that sounded like something out of a corporate thriller novel. He spoke with the casual authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of people. When he asked about my family, I gave him the short version. Just me and the Honda now. My dad and I barely talk. We had a falling out years ago over something stupid that became something big. My mom passed when I was in college. No siblings. So yeah, it's pretty much just me and whatever classic rock station is playing at any given moment. He went quiet again, staring out the window at the rain-soaked city rolling past. Then, so softly I almost didn't hear it, he said, You remind me of someone I lost." And just like that, the energy in the car shifted from casual conversation to something heavier, something that felt like grief dressed up in expensive clothing. The thing about driving strangers around for a living is that you become accustomed to a certain level of emotional detachment. People get in your car, they exist in your space for 15 minutes or an hour. They share fragments of their lives, complaints about their boss, excitement about a date, anxiety about a job interview, and then they disappear forever. You're like a mobile confessional booth, except instead of forgiving sins, you're just trying to maintain a 5-star rating and avoid getting 1-starred because someone didn't like your choice of air freshener. You learn not to get attached. You learn not to ask follow-up questions. You definitely learn not to let their stories creep under your skin and set up permanent residence in your brain. But Vernon Claiborne wasn't playing by those rules, and honestly, neither was I at this point. When he said I reminded him of someone he'd lost, the air in my Honda changed. It got heavier, thicker, like the rain outside had somehow seeped into the car and was pressing down on both of us. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, and his expression had shifted from that sharp, calculated businessman look to something more vulnerable, more human. His eyes were distant, staring at something only he could see, probably a memory that had been haunting him for longer than I'd been alive. I should have just nodded politely and changed the subject to something safe, like the Twins' chances this season or whether downtown traffic was always this terrible. That's what a professional Uber driver does. But something about this man made me break protocol, made me actually care about the answer. "Someone you lost?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, one of those newer iPhones that looked pristine and probably had never seen a cracked screen in its life. His fingers moved slowly across the screen, the way older people navigate technology, with careful deliberation like they're defusing a bomb instead of just scrolling through photos. Finally, he turned the phone toward me, angling it so I could see it in the rearview mirror without causing a traffic accident. The photo showed a young man, maybe late 20s or early 30s, standing in front of what looked like a modern office building. He had dark hair that was slightly too long, like he'd been meaning to get a haircut for weeks but kept forgetting. He wore a suit but had loosened his tie, and his smile was crooked, genuine, the kind of smile that suggested he'd just said something sarcastic right before someone snapped the picture. But it was his eyes that got me. They had this intensity to them, this fire that burned behind exhaustion, like he was running on determination and coffee and refusing to admit he was tired. "My son," Vernon said quietly, his voice carrying decades of grief compressed into 2 words. "Thomas. He died 15 years ago." Angry at me. I didn't know what to say to that. What are you supposed to say when someone casually drops a tragedy that massive into your lap while you're merging onto the highway in rush hour traffic? "I'm so sorry" felt inadequate, like bringing a water pistol to a 5-alarm fire. So, I just stayed quiet, letting him continue if he wanted to, which apparently he did. "We fought about business," Vernon continued, still staring at the photo like if he looked hard enough, his son might somehow climb out of the screen and back into existence. "Thomas wanted to expand the company faster, take bigger risks, break into international markets before we were ready. I wanted him to slow down, build a stronger foundation, wait for the right opportunities." Classic father-son disagreement. I thought I was protecting him from making mistakes I'd made. He thought I was holding him back from his potential. The rain was coming down harder now, and my wipers were working overtime, squeaking their protest with every pass. We were about 10 minutes from the Grandview Hotel, but it felt like we'd entered some kind of temporal bubble where normal rules didn't apply, and a complete stranger was about to tell me something that would fundamentally alter how I saw the world. He left the office that night after one of our arguments. The big one. The one where he said I'd never believed in him, that I'd rather see the company die than watch him succeed his own way. He'd been drinking at his desk, which he never did, but I'd pushed him that far. Vernon's voice cracked slightly, a hairline fracture in that otherwise composed exterior. He got in his car, drunk and furious, and he never made it home. Wrapped his BMW around a telephone pole on Highway 100. Died instantly, the police said, like that was supposed to be comforting. Jesus Christ. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles going white. This was heavy. Like, too heavy for 6:30 in the morning, too heavy for a random Uber ride. Too heavy for a guy like me who was barely holding his own life together with duct tape and denial. The last thing I ever said to him was that he wasn't ready to run a company. Vernon continued, and now I could hear the self-loathing in his voice, the kind that comes from 15 years of replaying the same conversation and wishing you could go back and say literally anything else. The last thing he said to me was that I'd regret underestimating him. And you know what? He was right. I've regretted it every single day since. The car felt too small suddenly, like the walls were closing in and taking all the oxygen with them. I wanted to say something profound, something that would ease even a fraction of this man's pain, but my brain was completely empty except for the sound of windshield wipers and the crushing weight of generational trauma being dumped on me by a stranger in a cashmere coat. Instead, what came out of my mouth was, at least he didn't have to sit in Minneapolis traffic. Silver lining. There was a beat of silence. One of those moments where you immediately regret everything you've ever said in your entire life and wonder if it's too late to eject yourself from your own vehicle. And then Vernon laughed. Actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a real, genuine, from-the-belly laugh that filled the car and seemed to crack open something that had been sealed shut for years. God, you sound just like him, Vernon said, wiping his eyes. Thomas would have said exactly that. Dark humor in the face of tragedy. Never knew when to be serious. I glanced at him again in the mirror, and he was smiling now, but it was one of those bittersweet smiles that contain multitudes, grief and love and regret and acceptance all mixed together in a way that made my chest hurt. You have his eyes, Vernon said, leaning forward slightly, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. Same fire, same stubbornness, same look like the world's beaten you down, but you're too annoyed to stay down. It's uncanny, actually. For once in my sarcastic, deflection-heavy life, I had absolutely no comeback. No joke, no witty retort, nothing. I just nodded, swallowing hard against that lump in my throat that had appeared out of nowhere, the one that no amount of humor could dissolve. Because there was something about the way this old man was looking at me, like I mattered, like I was more than just the guy driving him from point A to point B, like maybe the universe had put us in this car together for a reason bigger than a $23 fare. We were 3 blocks from the Grandview Hotel now, and I realized I didn't want this ride to end, which was crazy, considering we'd just had possibly the most depressing conversation I'd had since my divorce was finalized. But there was something about Vernon, something about his grief that felt familiar in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was because we were both carrying around losses that had fundamentally changed who we were. Maybe it was because we both understood what it felt like to have regrets so heavy they'd permanently altered your posture. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because some connections transcend logic and timing and the normal rules of how strangers are supposed to interact in the back seat of a Honda Civic at dawn. We were maybe 5 blocks from the Grandview Hotel when Vernon did something that completely derailed my understanding of how Uber rides were supposed to work. He leaned forward, tapped my shoulder gently, the kind of tap that suggested urgency without aggression, and said, "Pull over here, if you don't mind." I glanced around. We were on Hennepin Avenue, surrounded by a weird mix of upscale restaurants that charged $30 for avocado toast, and dive bars that looked like they'd been there since before I was born. The rain was still falling with the enthusiasm of a sky that had personal beef with the entire state of Minnesota, and pulling over here meant blocking a lane during what was rapidly becoming morning rush hour. "Here? Sir, we're literally 5 minutes from your hotel. Are you feeling okay? Do you need me to?" "I'm fine," he interrupted, but his voice had that quality that older people get when they're absolutely not fine, but they've spent so many decades pretending to be fine that they've perfected the lie. "Just pull over, please." So I did, because what else are you supposed to do when an 80-something-year-old man who just told you about his dead son asks you to pull over? I flipped on my hazard lights, which immediately made the car feel like a mobile emergency, and shifted into park. Behind us, someone honked. Because of course they did. Because Minneapolis drivers are contractually obligated to express their frustration at any minor inconvenience. Vernon sat back in his seat, and for the first time since he'd gotten in my car, he looked old. Not just elderly, but genuinely old, like the weight of every year he'd lived had suddenly decided to collect all at once. The rain drummed on the roof with a rhythm that felt almost meditative, and he stared out the window at nothing in particular. Or maybe at everything all at once. The way people do when they're seeing their entire life play out in their mind, like some kind of greatest hits reel that's heavy on the regrets. My doctor gave me 3 weeks, he said suddenly, matter-of-factly, like he was informing me about the weather forecast or telling me his hotel checkout time. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Spread to my liver, my lungs, pretty much everywhere that matters. They offered me treatment, but at my age, treatment just means dragging out the inevitable while feeling like garbage. So I declined. I froze. My hands were still on the steering wheel even though we were parked, and I realized I was gripping it so hard my fingers had gone numb. 3 weeks. This man had 3 weeks left on Earth, and he was spending part of that time in my beat-up Honda that smelled like a fast food crime scene, telling a complete stranger about his impending death. "Sir," I said, and my voice came out weird, strangled. "Are you, sure you want to be talking to me about this and not, say, your family? Or a priest? Or literally anyone else who's more qualified to handle existential conversations about mortality?" He chuckled, which seemed like an inappropriate response to being told someone was dying. But then again, what's the appropriate response? "My family's gone," he said simply. "Wife died 8 years ago from Alzheimer's. Spent the last 3 years not knowing who I was, which felt like a punishment custom designed for my specific sins. Thomas was our only child. No grandchildren, no nieces or nephews close enough to bother with. Just me and a company full of people who respect me professionally but wouldn't recognize me if they saw me outside the boardroom. The honesty was brutal, the kind that hits you in the chest and makes it hard to breathe. Here was a man who'd clearly built an empire, who wore shoes that cost more than my monthly rent, who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of people, and he was dying alone, confessing to his Uber driver because there was literally nobody else. "But maybe," Vernon continued, turning to look at me directly now, his eyes sharp despite the grief pooling in them. "Maybe I was meant to talk to you. Maybe that's how this works. The universe throws people together right when they need each other most, even if they don't realize it yet." Before I could process that statement or figure out if he was being philosophical or if the cancer had spread to his brain and was making him say weird things, Vernon pulled out a leather checkbook from his coat pocket. An actual checkbook. I hadn't seen someone use one of those in years. Most people paid for Uber through the app, and even the elderly passengers usually had their grandkids set up Apple Pay or something. But Vernon opened that checkbook like it was the most natural thing in the world, pulled out a pen that probably cost more than my car payment, and started writing with slow, deliberate strokes. "What are you doing?" I asked, suddenly nervous because this felt like it was heading somewhere I wasn't equipped to handle. "I'd like to give you something," he said, still writing, his handwriting surprisingly steady for someone who'd just admitted he was 3 weeks away from death. "Not for the ride. The app will handle that. This is for listening. For not treating me like I'm already dead. For making me laugh about Minneapolis traffic when I told you about my son." "Sir, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he interrupted, signing the check with a flourish that suggested he'd signed thousands of these over his lifetime. "That's precisely why I want to." He tore the check from the book with a satisfying rip, folded it twice with precise creases, and held it out to me. "Promise me something, though." I took the check, feeling the expensive paper between my fingers, but I didn't look at it yet because Vernon was staring at me with an intensity that demanded my full attention. "Promise you what?" "Call your father tonight," he said, and his voice had that quality that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive from a dying man who'd earned the right to make demands. "I don't care what you fought about. I don't care how long it's been. I don't care if it's awkward or uncomfortable or if you think it won't change anything. Call him." "Sir, my dad and I barely talk. We had a falling out 3 years ago about. It's complicated. We're just better off not." "There's no such thing as better off when it comes to family." Vernon cut me off, and now there was steel in his voice, the kind of authority that came from decades of running a company and making people listen whether they wanted to or not. "You think you have time to fix things later, but later disappears faster than you can imagine. I thought I'd have time to fix things with Thomas. I thought we'd have another argument and another, and eventually we'd figure it out, because that's what fathers and sons do, right? They fight and make up and fight again, and it's all part of the process." He paused, swallowing hard, and I realized this man was on the verge of tears in my back seat. But sometimes there is no later. Sometimes later is just an excuse we tell ourselves so we don't have to do the hard thing today. So promise me, call your father. Tonight. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. The check in my hand felt heavier than paper should. Okay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I promise. Vernon nodded, satisfied, and some of the tension left his shoulders. He reached for the door handle, preparing to get out into the rain that was still falling like the sky was personally mourning his impending death. But before he opened the door, he turned back one more time. You can't fix the past, son, he said, and the way he said son made my throat tight. But you can stop repeating it. That's the only real power we have, to break the cycles that broke us. Then he was gone, stepping out into the rain with that expensive coat and those polished shoes, closing the door gently behind him. I watched him walk toward the hotel entrance, moving slowly but with dignity, and he turned back once under the awning. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and sadness and hope all mixed together. I sat there for a long moment after he disappeared into the hotel, my hazard lights still blinking, rain drumming on the roof, feeling like I'd just been hit by an emotional freight train that I never saw coming. Finally, I looked down at the check in my hand, unfolding it carefully. The number made me do a double take, so hard I nearly gave myself whiplash. I held it up to the dome light, convinced I was reading it wrong, convinced that my sleep-deprived brain was adding zeros that didn't exist. But no, there it was, written in Vernon Claiborne's steady handwriting, $30,000. $30,000. The memo line said simply, "For listening." I laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that echoed in the empty car. Then I cried, ugly tears that came out of nowhere and everywhere all at once. Tears for Vernon and his dead son, and his 3 weeks left, and my own broken life, and every regret I'd been carrying around like it was my full-time job. The whole car smelled like old fries and expensive cologne, and the specific brand of grief that comes from realizing a complete stranger had just changed your life in the span of 45 minutes. I drove back to my usual spot behind the Walmart like a man operating on autopilot. Except autopilot was malfunctioning and kept replaying the last 45 minutes on an endless loop. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten more aggressive, like it was trying to wash away the entire city or at least make a solid attempt at flooding my consciousness with metaphorical symbolism. My windshield wipers kept up their squeaky protest, and I realized I'd been driving for 20 minutes without accepting any new ride requests because my brain had temporarily shut down all non-essential functions to process what the hell had just happened. I parked in my usual corner spot, killed the engine, and just sat there in the sudden silence that felt louder than the rain. The check was still in my hand. I'd been clutching it so hard during the drive back that my palm was sweaty, and I was worried I might accidentally smudge the ink and somehow invalidate $30,000 through sheer nervous perspiration. I unfolded it again, smoothing out the creases on my dashboard, holding it up to the gray morning light filtering through my windshield like I was some kind of currency inspector checking for counterfeit bills. $30,000. Written in actual ink, on actual paper, from an actual checkbook like we were living in 1987. The signature at the bottom, Vernon Claiborne, was elegant, confident, the signature of a man who'd signed important documents his entire life and never once doubted whether the check would clear. In the top left corner was a bank name I recognized, one of those old money institutions that probably required a certain net worth just to walk through their doors without security escorting you out. I thought maybe it was a typo, like, perhaps Vernon had meant to write 3,000 or 300, and in his dying man emotional state, he'd accidentally added a zero. Or 2 zeros. But no, the amount was written out in words too, 30,000 and $00/$100. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. This dying pharmaceutical executive had just handed his Uber driver enough money to fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life, with a memo line that simply said "for listening," like listening was some kind of rare commodity worth more than most people's annual salary. My whole car smelled like shock. If shock had a smell, which it doesn't, but if it did, it would be a combination of old fries, cheap air freshener, expensive cologne, and the specific scent of disbelief mixed with tears. I realized I was still crying, which was embarrassing even though nobody was around to witness it. When's the last time I'd cried? Really cried. Not just teared up during a particularly emotional commercial or when I found out Biscuit had run away. Probably the day the divorce was finalized and I had to sign papers that legally dissolved 5 years of my life into a document that got filed in a government office somewhere and forgotten. But this was different. These weren't sad tears or angry tears or even particularly happy tears. These were what the hell just happened tears, the kind that come from your soul getting sucker punched by unexpected kindness from a complete stranger who was 3 weeks away from death and decided to spend part of his remaining time making sure a broke Uber driver might have a chance at not being broke anymore. I pulled out my phone, checked my bank account because that's what you do when you're holding a check that could potentially solve most of your immediate financial problems. Balance: $847.32. That was it. That was everything I had to my name after 5 years of building a business and a life that had been systematically dismantled by betrayal and bad luck. $847 stood between me and complete financial catastrophe, and I'd been living on that edge for so long I'd started to think it was normal, like maybe everyone was one missed car payment away from sleeping in their vehicle. But $30,000? That was breathing room. That was security deposit and first month's rent on an actual apartment, instead of crashing on my buddy Marcus's couch and pretending I was between places, instead of admitting I was homeless. That was fixing the weird noise my Honda had been making for 3 months that I'd been ignoring because I couldn't afford a mechanic. That was not having to choose between eating dinner and putting gas in my tank. That was dignity, actual, tangible dignity in check form. The sun was starting to rise, weak and watery behind the rain clouds, and the Walmart parking lot was filling up with early morning shoppers and employees starting their shifts. I watched a woman park 3 spots over, juggling an umbrella and a coffee, and a toddler who clearly didn't want to be awake at 7 in the morning. Life was just continuing around me like normal, like the entire universe hadn't just shifted on its axis during a random airport pickup. Vernon's voice echoed in my head. "Promise me you'll call your father tonight." I looked at my phone, at my dad's contact information that I hadn't touched in 3 years except for the obligatory "Merry Christmas" text that we'd exchanged last December, like 2 people checking off a social obligation. Our falling out had been stupid. One of those arguments that starts about something small and snowballs into something massive because both people are too proud to back down. He'd said something critical about my business when it was struggling, something about how I should have been more careful, should have seen Miranda's betrayal coming, should have protected myself better. I'd responded by telling him he didn't understand anything about my life, and maybe if he'd been a better father, I would have learned how to pick better partners. It was cruel and unfair, and we both knew it. But instead of apologizing, we just stopped talking. 3 years of silence because 2 grown men couldn't figure out how to say, "I'm sorry," without it feeling like admitting defeat. I sat there in that Walmart parking lot for another hour, watching the rain slowly taper off into a drizzle, holding a $30,000 check from a dying man who'd made me promise to break a cycle I didn't even realize I was perpetuating. Finally, around 8:30 in the morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I called my dad. He picked up on the first ring, which surprised me. His voice came through my car speakers via Bluetooth, sounding older than I remembered, rough with sleep or emotion or both. "Liam, you okay?" Not "hello." Not "this is unexpected." Just immediate concern that something was wrong because why else would his estranged son be calling him at 8:30 on a random Thursday morning? It made my chest hurt. The realization that despite 3 years of silence, his first instinct was still to worry about whether I was okay. "Yeah," I said, and my voice cracked embarrassingly. "Yeah, Dad, I'm okay. I paused, trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened without sounding completely insane. I just met a guy who reminded me that we're both still alive, and that maybe that matters more than whatever stupid thing we've been fighting about." There was a long pause on the other end. The kind of pause that contains entire conversations that don't need to be spoken out loud. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him sitting in his kitchen with his morning coffee, trying to process why his son was suddenly calling him with vague philosophical statements about mortality. "You sound like you've been crying," he said finally, his voice gentle in a way I'd forgotten it could be. "Nope," I lied automatically. "Just emotional allergies. Very severe. The pollen count is brutal today." He laughed. A short, surprise sound that I hadn't heard in 3 years. It's been raining all morning, Liam. There's no pollen. Okay, fine. I've been crying, I admitted. But in my defense, I just had possibly the weirdest and most emotionally devastating Uber ride of my entire career, and a dying millionaire just gave me $30,000 for listening to him talk about his dead son. And now I'm sitting in a Walmart parking lot having an existential crisis about family and regret, and whether I'm going to end up dying alone with nobody to talk to except random strangers. Another pause. Then, where are you? I'm coming to get you. Dad, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, he interrupted, and I realized where I'd gotten my stubbornness from. Give me the address. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He lived 40 minutes away in Bloomington, but I gave him the address anyway because apparently, this was happening whether I was ready for it or not. While I waited, I turned on the radio to avoid thinking too hard about what I'd just set in motion. Some classic rock station was playing Landslide by Fleetwood Mac, which felt aggressively on the nose for my current emotional state. But I listened anyway because when the universe decides to get poetic, you might as well lean into it. My dad showed up in 35 minutes, driving faster than he should have in post-rain conditions, which felt like its own kind of love language. He pulled up next to my Honda in his sensible Toyota Camry that he'd been driving since I was in high school, and when he got out, I realized he looked older too. More gray hair, deeper lines around his eyes, that slight stoop that comes from decades of carrying weight you can't put down. We stared at each other across the parking lot for a moment, two stubborn men who'd spent 3 years being too proud to admit they missed each other. Then he walked over and tapped on my window, and I rolled it down. You look like hell, he said. Thanks, Dad. Really feeling the love here. Come on, he said, opening my door. I'm buying you breakfast. Real breakfast, not whatever gas station garbage you've been surviving on. We ended up at a Perkins because that's where Midwestern fathers take their sons when emotional reconciliation requires pancakes. We sat across from each other in a booth that had probably witnessed 1,000 similar conversations, and we ate mediocre eggs and drank coffee that tasted like forgiveness tastes when it's been 3 years overdue, bitter, sweet, and necessary all at once. I woke up the next morning feeling like I'd been emotionally hangover. You know, that specific exhaustion that comes from crying, reconciling with your estranged father, and processing the fact that a dying stranger had handed you enough money to temporarily solve your life. My phone was buzzing on the floor next to Marcus's couch where I'd been crashing for the past 4 months, and I seriously considered ignoring it because it was 7 in the morning and whoever was calling me at this hour clearly didn't respect the universal law that nothing good happens before 8 a.m. But then I remembered the check and the possibility that maybe it was the bank calling to confirm that yes, this insane deposit was legitimate and not some elaborate prank. So I rolled off the couch. Literally rolled, because apparently I'd been sleeping in a position that had turned my spine into a pretzel, and grabbed my phone. Unknown number. Twin Cities area code. I answered with my professional Uber voice, the one I used when I was pretending to be a functional human being instead of a disaster held together by cheap coffee and denial. Hello, Mr. Liam Henley? The voice on the other end was male, crisp, with that particular cadence that lawyers develop where every word sounds like it's been carefully selected from a dictionary of formal speech. He pronounced my name correctly too, which was notable because half the people I encountered called me Liam, like I was some kind of Australian export. Who's asking? I said, because my natural instinct when someone uses my full name is to assume I'm either in trouble or about to be sold something I don't need. If this is about my car's extended warranty, I'm going to save us both some time and tell you I can barely afford the regular warranty. This is Atticus Brandwell, he continued, completely unfazed by my sarcasm, which suggested he dealt with difficult people professionally. I'm the senior partner at Brandwell and Associates, and I'm calling regarding Mr. Vernon Claiborne. I understand you drove him from the airport yesterday morning. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the sudden, terrible certainty that this conversation was about to go somewhere I wasn't prepared for. Yeah, I said slowly, sitting down on Marcus's couch because my legs suddenly felt unreliable. I drove him to the Grandview Hotel. Is he okay? There was a pause. One of those professionally calibrated pauses that lawyers use right before they deliver bad news that's going to fundamentally alter your understanding of reality. I'm afraid Mr. Claiborne passed away last night. peacefully, in his sleep. The hotel staff found him this morning when he didn't respond to their wake-up call. The room tilted slightly, and I realized I'd stopped breathing. Vernon was dead. The man I'd spent 45 minutes with yesterday, who'd told me about his son and his regrets, and given me a check that was currently sitting in my wallet like a time bomb of generosity, was just gone. 3 weeks, his doctor had said. He'd had 3 weeks. He'd gotten less than 24 hours. Mr. Henley? Are you still there? Yeah, I managed, my voice coming out weird and distant like it belonged to someone else. Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry. I didn't know him well, but he seemed like a good man. He was, Atticus said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice now, the kind that suggested this wasn't just a client to him, but someone he'd actually cared about. Which is why I'm calling. Mr. Claiborne contacted me yesterday afternoon, shortly after you dropped him at his hotel. He made some significant changes to his will. Oh no. Oh God. I knew where this was going, and every cell in my body wanted to hang up the phone and pretend this conversation had never happened, because there was no version of reality where this ended well for me. Mr. Henley, you're named in the will. Named as what? I said, trying to keep my voice light, trying to joke my way out of whatever cosmic insanity was about to be dropped on my head. His therapist? His Uber driver of the year? The guy who made him laugh about traffic one time. As his heir, Atticus said calmly, like he was informing me about the weather instead of completely derailing my entire understanding of how the universe worked. Specifically, you've been designated as the primary beneficiary of his estate. He left you everything. Approximately $89 million in liquid assets, controlling shares of Claiborne Pharmaceuticals, several properties including his residence in Edina, and various other holdings that we'll need to discuss in detail. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. A sharp, hysterical sound that echoed in Marcus's living room and probably woke him up in his bedroom down the hall. Sir, I said, still laughing because the alternative was screaming or possibly passing out. I think you've got the wrong Liam Henley. There's probably another one somewhere in the Twin Cities who isn't currently living on his friend's couch and powered by instant noodles. You should try calling him instead. No, Mr. Henley. Atticus replied with the patience of someone who'd clearly dealt with people in shock before. Vernon was very specific. He left detailed instructions, and he also left you a letter. I think you'll want to sit down for this, if you're not already sitting down, that is. I'm sitting, I said, gripping the edge of the couch like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly started spinning off its axis. I'm very, very sitting. Would you be able to come to my office this afternoon? I'm located downtown, and I think it would be beneficial to discuss this in person. I'll also need to verify your identity and walk you through the legal requirements of inheriting an estate of this size. Also, Vernon's letter, he specifically requested that you read it in the presence of his family. His family, I said, confused. I thought he said he didn't have any family left. Not immediate family, Atticus clarified. But there are some distant relatives who were contacted regarding his passing. They'll be at the reading this afternoon as well. 2 p.m., if that works for you. I looked around Marcus's living room, at the pile of my clothes in the corner that I kept meaning to organize, at my laptop that was held together with duct tape, at the life I'd been living for the past 6 months that could generously be described as barely functional. Then I looked at my phone, at the timestamp that said 7:04 a.m., and realized I had approximately 7 hours to process the fact that a dying man I'd met for 45 minutes had apparently decided to leave me his entire fortune. Yeah, I said, my voice hollow. Yeah, 2 p.m. works. Can you text me the address? Of course. And Mr. Henley? Congratulations. Not everyone gets a second chance like this. After he hung up, I just sat there on Marcus's couch, staring at my phone like it might suddenly offer some explanation for what was happening to my life. Marcus emerged from his bedroom about 5 minutes later, squinting against the morning light, wearing boxer shorts and a t-shirt that said, "I'm not arguing. I'm just explaining why I'm right." "Dude," he said, yawning. "Why are you awake? And why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" "I think I might have," I said quietly. "Or maybe I'm about to become one. I can't tell anymore." Marcus stared at me, clearly trying to determine if I was having some kind of mental breakdown or if this was just standard Liam behavior. "You want to elaborate on that cryptic nonsense, or are we doing the whole mysterious protagonist thing today?" So I told him. I told him everything. About Vernon, about the ride, about the $30,000 check that was still in my wallet, about the phone call I'd just received from a lawyer with a name that sounded like he belonged in a Jane Austen novel. Marcus listened with increasing disbelief, his eyes getting wider with every sentence, until finally he just sat down on the couch next to me and said the only thing that made sense. Holy shit. Yeah, I agreed. Holy shit. So you're telling me, Marcus said slowly, processing, that you gave a dying millionaire a ride from the airport. He liked you so much he gave you 30 grand. Then he went back to his hotel and literally rewrote his will to leave you everything. And then he died? All in less than 24 hours. That appears to be the situation, yes. That's insane. That's literally insane. That doesn't happen in real life. That happens in movies where the plot is so contrived everyone complains about it being unrealistic. And yet, I said, holding up my phone with Atticus's text message containing the address of Brandwell and Associates. Here we are, living in a contrived movie plot. Marcus leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling like it might have answers. So what are you going to do? I'm going to go to this meeting, I said, standing up because sitting still felt impossible now. I'm going to read whatever letter Vernon left me. I'm going to meet his family, who probably hate me already because some random Uber driver is inheriting everything while they get nothing. And then I'm probably going to have a complete nervous breakdown in a lawyer's office, which seems fitting given how my life's been going lately. You need me to come with you? Marcus asked, and the fact that he offered without hesitation reminded me why he'd been letting me crash on his couch for 4 months without complaint. Nah, I said, heading toward the bathroom because I suddenly realized I needed to shower and look like someone who could theoretically be trusted with $89 million. But if you don't hear from me by 5 p.m., assume I've been murdered by angry relatives and call the police. That's not funny, Marcus called after me. Who said I was joking? I yelled back, turning on the shower and watching the water run while I tried to mentally prepare for what was about to be either the best or worst afternoon of my entire life. Spoiler alert, it was going to be both. The offices of Brandwell and Associates occupied the entire 14th floor of a downtown building that made my Honda look like a sad joke on wheels. Everything about the place screamed old money in a way that was both intimidating and vaguely offensive. Like the furniture itself was judging me for showing up in khakis from Target and a button-up shirt I'd borrowed from Marcus because everything I owned was either wrinkled, stained, or both. The reception area smelled like leather and wood polish and the quiet confidence that comes from generations of wealthy people solving their problems with expensive lawyers. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with perfect posture and a smile that suggested she'd perfected the art of being professionally pleasant, directed me to a conference room down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-looking men who'd probably never driven an Uber in their lives. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see several people already seated, and my stomach did that thing where it tries to escape through your throat because you're about to walk into a situation you're catastrophically unprepared for. Atticus Brandwell met me at the door. He was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer named Atticus. 60-something, silver hair, expensive suit that probably cost more than I'd made in the last 6 months, and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck like he was actively cosplaying as everyone's distinguished grandfather. He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who'd spent decades negotiating deals that moved millions of dollars. Mr. Henley, he said warmly, thank you for coming. I know this must be overwhelming. That's one word for it, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Other words include surreal, terrifying. And is this a prank show? Because if it is, the production value is incredible. He smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I assure you, this is quite real. Please, come in. There are some people I'd like you to meet. I followed him into the conference room, and immediately I turned to look at me. There were 4 other people seated around a massive wooden table that looked like it had witnessed more important conversations than I'd had in my entire life. 2 older women who I immediately pegged as distant relatives based on their matching expressions of polite confusion mixed with barely concealed resentment. A younger guy, maybe early 40s, in a business suit that screamed middle management, looking at me like I was a math problem he couldn't solve. And then, sitting at the far end of the table, was someone who made my brain short-circuit entirely. My dad. What? I started, but my dad held up his hand, looking just as confused as I felt. Liam, I got a call from Mr. Brandwell's office this morning. They said I needed to be here. Something about family records, and I don't understand what's happening any more than you do. Atticus gestured for me to sit, then took his position at the head of the table like a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra through a particularly complicated symphony. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know this is unusual, and I appreciate your patience. As you all know, Vernon Claiborne passed away yesterday morning. His death, while not unexpected given his diagnosis, came sooner than anticipated. One of the older women, she had that pursed-lipped look of someone who'd spent her entire life being mildly disappointed by everything, cleared her throat. Mr. Brandwell, I don't mean to be rude, but why is there a stranger at this reading? We're family, however distant, and this young man is. Essential to understanding Vernon's final wishes, Atticus interrupted smoothly, which will become clear momentarily. Now, if we could proceed. He pulled out a manila envelope that looked like it contained either extremely important documents or the instructions for some kind of elaborate treasure hunt. Vernon left a letter that he requested be read aloud in the presence of everyone gathered here today. Mr. Henley, this is primarily addressed to you, but its contents concern everyone in this room. He opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in handwriting. Vernon's handwriting, I realized, the same elegant script I'd seen on the $30,000 check. Atticus cleared his throat and began to read, and I swear to God, the temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Liam, Atticus read, his voice taking on a softer quality. If you're hearing this, I'm gone. Faster than expected, probably, because that's how pancreatic cancer works. It doesn't care about timelines or unfinished business. I know you'll want to refuse this inheritance. You'll think it's too much, that you don't deserve it, that there's been some mistake. But I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you, because it's going to change how you understand everything. I felt my dad's eyes on me, but I couldn't look at him. I was frozen, every muscle in my body locked in place, while Atticus continued. After my son Thomas died, my wife Eleanor and I searched desperately for his girlfriend. We knew he'd been serious about someone, that they'd been talking about getting married, but he'd kept the relationship private because I'd been difficult about his personal life the same way I was difficult about his professional life. Her name was Margaret Henley. My dad made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that was almost a gasp. I turned to look at him, and his face had gone completely white. Margaret, my dad whispered. My sister Margaret. The room was spinning now, or maybe I was spinning and the room was staying still. I couldn't tell anymore. Atticus continued reading, his voice steady even as he delivered information that was systematically destroying my understanding of reality. Margaret was pregnant when Thomas died. She was only 23, scared, and alone. We tried to find her, hired private investigators, contacted every Henley in Minnesota, but she disappeared. Eleanor and I spent years wondering about that child, about our grandchild who we'd never meet, who would grow up never knowing they were part of our family. It became Eleanor's obsession in her final years, before Alzheimer's took her memory. She'd talk about finding the baby, even when she couldn't remember my name. One of the older women was crying now, soft tears that she was trying to hide behind a tissue. The younger guy in the business suit just looked confused, like he'd shown up for a regular reading and accidentally walked into a soap opera. Yesterday, Atticus continued, my private investigator, whom I'd kept on retainer for 15 years, just in case, finally found something. Adoption records. Margaret gave birth to a son in 1991. She died 2 years later from complications of lupus, and the child was adopted by her brother. Atticus paused, looking at my dad, Daniel Henley, and his wife Rebecca. The silence in that conference room was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. My dad was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Shock, realization, grief, and something that might have been relief all mixed together in a way that made him look 10 years older. Wait, I said, and my voice came out strangled. Wait, are you saying? The child Margaret gave birth to, Atticus read. Her son, Thomas's son, is you, Liam. You're my grandson. The world tilted sideways. I heard someone say, oh my God, but couldn't tell if it was me or someone else in the room. My dad had his face in his hands now, shoulders shaking, and I realized he was crying. Actually crying, something I'd seen maybe twice in my entire life. You reminded me of my boy not just in name, Atticus continued, his own voice starting to crack slightly, but in heart, in spirit, in that stubborn refusal to give up even when everything's falling apart. When you told me about your business, about your divorce, about losing everything, I saw Thomas. And when you made me laugh about Minneapolis traffic right after I told you about the worst moment of my life, I knew. I knew you were someone who understood that humor isn't disrespect, it's survival. I couldn't breathe. The room was too small, too bright, too full of people watching me process information that should have come with a manual or at least a warning label. I have 3 weeks, the doctors said. I'm using one day to make sure you get what should have been yours all along. Not just money, but family. A history. A place to belong. You listened when I needed forgiveness most. You called your father because I asked you to. You're already more of a grandson than I deserve, and you didn't even know it yet. My dad stood up suddenly, walked around the table, and pulled me into a hug that nearly knocked me off my chair. I'm so sorry, he was saying over and over. I'm so sorry I never told you. We always meant to, but you were so young when Rebecca died, and then it never seemed like the right time, and Dad, I managed, my voice muffled against his shoulder. Dad, I know this is a lot, Atticus read, wiping his own eyes now. I know you'll have questions, and I'm sorry I'm not there to answer them. But I've left detailed records, letters from Margaret, photos of Thomas, everything I could compile. You deserve to know where you came from. And Thomas, wherever he is, deserved to know his son turned out to be exactly the kind of man he would have been proud of. I pulled away from my dad, looking around the conference room at these strangers who were suddenly, impossibly, family. The older women were both crying openly now. The guy in the business suit looked like he was trying to process quantum physics while underwater. And me? I laughed. Nervous, ugly, hysterical laughter that echoed off the expensive wood paneling and probably violated some kind of sacred law about maintaining dignity in law offices. Of course, I said, still laughing even as tears streamed down my face. Of course. Why not find out the dying millionaire is my secret grandpa? That tracks. That absolutely tracks with how my life has been going. Then I stopped laughing and started crying instead. Deep, ugly sobs that I'd been holding in for months or maybe years. Grief for grandparents I'd never known. For a biological father who'd died before I was born. For a mother who'd given me up because she was too young and too sick to keep me. For a grandfather who'd found me in the back of a Honda and had exactly one day to be my family before the universe took him away too. 3 weeks after Vernon's funeral, which was attended by approximately 400 people including politicians, pharmaceutical executives, and 2 very confused relatives who'd just discovered they were related through a tragic web of secrets and bad timing, I got another call from Atticus Brandwell. This time, I answered with significantly less panic because I'd spent the past 21 days in a surreal blur of legal paperwork, bank meetings, and intense therapy sessions where I tried to explain to a professional that yes, I'd inherited $89 million from my dead grandfather, who I'd met once while driving him from the airport. And no, I wasn't handling it particularly well. Thank you for asking. Liam, Atticus said, and I'd gotten used to his voice now. That calm, measured tone that suggested nothing could possibly surprise him anymore. There's someone I'd like you to meet. Another piece of the puzzle, if you will. Are you available this afternoon? I looked around the apartment I'd just signed a lease on, my first non-couch living situation in 6 months, which was currently furnished with exactly 1 folding chair and a sense of overwhelming disorientation. Yeah, I said. I'm available. What kind of puzzle piece are we talking about here? Because if it's another secret relative, I'm going to need advance warning and possibly medication. Atticus chuckled. Not a secret exactly. Just someone who has been looking for family as long as Vernon was. His name is Sean Henley. He's your cousin, Thomas's other son. The phone nearly slipped out of my hand. I'm sorry, Thomas's what now? Margaret wasn't Thomas's only relationship, Atticus explained patiently. Before he met her, he dated a woman named Sarah Chun. They broke up when Thomas was 25, and Sarah discovered she was pregnant shortly after. She tried to contact him, but he'd already started dating Margaret and, well, it's complicated. Sarah raised the child alone, eventually married someone else, and their son Sean grew up knowing his biological father had died before he was born but never knowing who he was. Jesus Christ, I muttered, sitting down on my one folding chair because standing felt like too ambitious an activity given this new information. How many secret relatives am I going to discover? Is this going to be a weekly thing? Should I just start planning for surprise family members to emerge from the woodwork every Thursday? Just Sean, as far as we know, Atticus said with what sounded like amusement. Vernon's investigator found him about 2 years ago, but Vernon wanted to meet him in person and his health kept declining. They'd been planning a meeting that never happened. When I contacted Sean about Vernon's death and explained the family connection, he expressed interest in meeting you. If you're comfortable with that. Comfortable wasn't the word I'd use. Terrified, overwhelmed, curious in that way you're curious about whether you can fit your entire fist in your mouth. Technically possible, but probably a bad idea. Yeah, I said finally. Yeah, okay. Where and when? We met at a coffee shop in St. Paul, neutral territory, Atticus had suggested, somewhere public but not too crowded. I arrived 15 minutes early because apparently inheriting millions of dollars hadn't cured my anxiety-driven punctuality, and I ordered a coffee I didn't drink because my hands needed something to do besides shake. At exactly 2 p.m., a man walked in who made me do a double take so hard I nearly spilled my untouched beverage. Sean Henley looked like someone had taken a photo of Vernon, aged it backwards about 50 years, and added a healthy dose of Asian features that must have come from his mother. He was maybe 35, tall, with Thomas's same dark hair and Vernon's intense eyes, wearing jeans and a hoodie that suggested he was approximately as comfortable with this situation as I was. When our eyes met across the coffee shop, there was this moment of mutual recognition, not because we knew each other, but because we were both walking evidence of the same complicated family history. He walked over, and we both just stood there for a second like two people who'd been told to hug, but weren't sure if that's what you did when meeting the cousin you didn't know existed until 3 weeks ago. Finally, he stuck out his hand and said, "So, this is weird, right? I'm not the only one finding this incredibly weird." I shook his hand, laughing despite myself. "Oh my God, thank you. Everyone keeps acting like discovering secret relatives is totally normal, and I've been feeling crazy for thinking this is the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me." "Right," Sean said, sitting down across from me with visible relief. "My wife keeps telling me to process my feelings and explore this new connection, and I'm like, babe, I'm still processing the fact that I'm apparently related to a pharmaceutical empire. The feelings are going to have to wait their turn." We talked for 3 hours. Not about money or inheritances or legal complications. We talked about growing up not knowing where we came from, about that specific flavor of confusion that comes from being told you're adopted but never getting the full story. Sean had been raised by his mom and stepdad in St. Paul, had 3 kids of his own, worked as an architect, and had spent his entire life with this vague sense that there was information missing from his personal narrative. "I always thought I was unwanted," Sean admitted, stirring his 3rd coffee of the afternoon. "Like, my biological father didn't want me, which is why he wasn't in the picture. Finding out he never knew I existed, that he died before he could know, that's somehow worse and better at the same time." "Yeah," I said, understanding exactly what he meant. It's like, you can't be mad at a dead guy, but you're also mad that the universe didn't give him the chance to know you existed. It's complicated grief for someone you never met, but were supposed to be connected to. Exactly. Sean leaned forward, animated now. And then finding out Vernon spent years looking for family, that he died knowing about you, but not about me. God, I don't even know how to feel about that. Relieved I wasn't rejected? Sad I missed the chance to meet him? Angry that there was this whole family history I could have been part of? All of the above, I suggested. I think you're allowed to feel all of it simultaneously. Grief doesn't follow logic. We exchanged phone numbers, made tentative plans to meet again with our respective families. My dad, his mom, his wife and kids, the distant relatives from the law office who'd turned out to be second cousins twice removed, or something equally complicated. We created a group chat that we ironically titled The Surprise Henley Family Reunion Nobody Asked For. We laughed about it because laughing was easier than crying, even though we both probably needed to do more of the latter. A week later, we attended Vernon's actual memorial service together, not the funeral, which had been the massive public affair with news coverage and pharmaceutical industry representatives, but a smaller, private memorial that Atticus had organized specifically for family. It was just us, my dad, Sean's mom Sarah, Sean's wife and kids, and the two older women from the law office whose names I'd learned were Helen and Patricia, Vernon's second cousins who'd spent their lives knowing him as the successful distant relative they saw at occasional holiday gatherings. The service was held at a small chapel in Edina, and everyone who spoke talked about Vernon the person, not Vernon the businessman. Helen told a story about how he'd paid for her son's medical school without ever mentioning it, how she'd only found out years later. Patricia described how he'd shown up unannounced at her husband's funeral and sat with her for 3 hours, not saying much, just being present. Sarah talked about how, when she'd finally tracked down Thomas's family after his death, Vernon had helped her financially even though they weren't related, because that's what you did for the mother of your son's child. When the priest asked if anyone else wanted to speak, I stood up before I could talk myself out of it. Walking to the front of that chapel felt like walking through water, but I got there eventually and turned to face this bizarre collection of people who were somehow my family now. I was Vernon's Uber driver. I started, and several people smiled because apparently Atticus had told them the story. We talked for 45 minutes about failure, ambition, regret, and how fast people disappear when you lose everything. He told me about his son. He showed me a photo. He cried in my back seat while telling me about an argument that ended with death, and I had no idea I was looking at pictures of my biological father. My voice cracked, but I pushed through. Vernon gave me $30,000 for listening to him. That's what the memo line said, for listening. Like listening was some rare commodity worth more than most people's annual salary. And maybe it is. Maybe in a world where everyone's rushing to the next thing, stopping to actually hear someone's story, really hear it, not just wait for your turn to talk. Maybe that's worth everything. I paused, looking at Sean, at my dad, at this collection of people who'd been scattered by time and circumstance and brought back together by one old man's determination to fix what he could before he died. Vernon spent 15 years looking for family he never got to meet. He found me by accident, in the back of a Honda that smelled like old fries, and he decided that was enough. That 45 minutes was enough to build a bridge across decades of loss. Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't even try to hide them. People keep asking me what I'm going to do with the money, how I'm going to handle the company, the properties, the responsibility. And honestly, I have no idea. But I know what Vernon would want me to do with the family, the actual family, the people in this room who are connected by tragedy and love, and the stubborn refusal to let one generation's pain become the next generation's prison. I looked directly at Sean. He'd want us to know each other, to break the cycle of silence and secrets that kept us apart, to stop letting pride and fear and complicated grief keep us from the people who are supposed to matter most. After the service, we all went to a diner, because apparently that's the Henley family way of processing emotions, over mediocre coffee and breakfast food served at inappropriate times of day. Sean's kids ran around being delightfully chaotic while the adults tried to map out family trees on napkins and kept getting confused about who was related to whom and how. My dad and Sarah had a long conversation about Margaret, sharing memories of a woman who'd been too young and too sick to raise her son, but had loved him enough to make sure he had a family who could. Helen and Patricia told stories about Vernon that made him seem less like an intimidating pharmaceutical executive and more like a complicated man who'd spent his life trying to atone for one terrible argument with his son. Money doesn't solve everything, but it sure as hell helps you think clearer when you're not choosing between dinner and rent. I learned that pretty quickly once the estate actually transferred and my bank account went from 3 digits to 9 digits, which remains the most surreal sentence I've ever had to process. For about a week, I just stared at my phone, refreshing my banking app like it might suddenly correct itself and reveal this had all been an elaborate prank. But it wasn't a prank, and Vernon's fortune came with something more valuable than the money itself. It came with purpose. I knew exactly what he'd want me to do with it, because he'd told me in that Honda, break the cycle. Stop repeating the past. Use what you've been given to help people who are drowning the way we both drowned. So I restarted Greendale Gardens, not landscapes, gardens, because I wanted it to be about growth, not just maintenance. My brother Jake, who'd been working construction and hating every minute of it, became my partner. We hired people who'd lost their businesses, who'd been betrayed by partners, who were one bad month away from sleeping in their cars like I'd been. Our first employee was a 53-year-old woman named Carol whose bakery had failed after her husband cleaned out their joint account and disappeared to Florida with his 25-year-old secretary. Our second was a mechanic named Ray who'd lost his shop when his son's medical bills bankrupted the family. We called our charity wing the Claiborne Foundation for Second Chances because Vernon had given me one, and I'd be damned if I wasn't going to pass it forward. Within 6 months, we'd helped 47 families, covering medical bills, restarting businesses, providing interest-free loans to people the banks had written off as bad investments. Every person who walked through our door got treated like they mattered, because Vernon had treated me like I mattered when I was nobody special. When Miranda heard about it, because of course she heard about it, bad news travels fast, but apparently, so does news about your ex-husband inheriting a pharmaceutical empire. She sent me a message. Just 3 words. Can we talk? I stared at that text for a full minute before responding with 4 words that gave me more satisfaction than they probably should have. Sure. My lawyer loves talking. We never did talk. Turns out when your ex-wife realizes you're no longer desperate, she suddenly has nothing to say. Funny how that works. The foundation became my full-time job, and Jake ran Greendale Gardens with the kind of passion I'd always wished I could have maintained before exhaustion and betrayal beat it out of me. We expanded into landscaping contracts with affordable housing developments, created job training programs, hired ex-convicts nobody else would give a chance to. Vernon's money was working harder than it ever had sitting in investment accounts, and every time we helped someone, I thought about that 45-minute ride and how one person deciding to see another person's humanity can change everything. Sometimes people asked me if I felt guilty, inheriting money from a man I'd known for less than an hour, getting a fortune I hadn't earned while other people worked their entire lives for scraps. And yeah, some days I felt guilty as hell. But then I'd remember Vernon's face when he talked about his son, remember how he'd said, "You can't fix the past, but you can stop repeating it." And I'd realize guilt was just another way of staying stuck. So I kept moving forward, kept writing checks to people who needed second chances, kept building the kind of legacy Vernon wished he'd built with Thomas. One based on forgiveness instead of regret, on listening instead of judging, on believing people deserve another shot, even when everything says they don't. I still drive Uber once a week, Thursday mornings, just to stay humble and remember where I came from. People think I'm insane when I tell them this. You're worth how much and you're still driving strangers around Minneapolis at 6 a.m.? Yeah, I am, because the moment I forget what it felt like to be invisible, desperate, and one broken windshield wiper away from a complete breakdown is the moment I become exactly the kind of person Vernon spent his life regretting being. My Honda's long gone. Donated it to a single mom who needed reliable transportation more than I needed the memories of rock bottom. Now I drive a decent Toyota that doesn't smell like existential crisis, and I've upgraded my air freshener game considerably. But the principle remains the same. Every Thursday, I log into the app, accept rides, and listen to people's stories like they matter, because they do. Last Thursday morning, I picked up a young woman from an apartment complex in Uptown. She got in my back seat, and I immediately recognized the look. The same exhausted, defeated expression I'd worn for 6 months straight. Red eyes that suggested she'd been crying recently, shoulders hunched like she was trying to take up as little space as possible in the world, that specific energy of someone whose dreams had just been systematically demolished. Rough morning, I asked, pulling away from the curb. She laughed, but it was one of those laughs that's actually just crying in disguise. Rough year more like. My restaurant failed. I put everything into it. My savings, my parents' life savings, maxed out every credit card, convinced all my friends to invest. And it just failed. Bad location, worse timing, and apparently I'm terrible at business even though I'm a great chef. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, seeing my own past reflected back at me with uncomfortable clarity. Let me guess, I said. Now your parents think you ruined their retirement, your friends aren't returning your calls, and you're questioning every decision you've ever made. She looked up, surprised. How did you, yeah? Exactly that. Been there, I said simply. Different business, same devastation. Lost everything including my dog, who apparently had standards about the kind of human he was willing to live with. That got a real laugh out of her, small but genuine. We drove in silence for a few minutes while she composed herself, And I thought about Vernon, about that rainy morning that had changed everything, about how he'd looked at me and seen his son instead of just another Uber driver, about how one person deciding to care can alter the entire trajectory of someone's life. At a red light, I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out one of the business cards we'd had printed for the foundation. I handed it back to her. "Someone once believed in me when I didn't deserve it," I said, "when I was drowning and convinced I'd never surface. This is a foundation that helps people restart after failure. No judgment, no lectures about what you should have done differently, just resources and support. Give them a call." She took the card, studying it with confusion. "Why would a stranger help me? What's the catch?" "No catch," I said as the light turned green. "Just paying forward something that was given to me. Because sometimes family isn't who you're born to. It's who fate throws into your car in the middle of a thunderstorm when you both need saving." She looked at me like I'd just spoken in riddles, but she pocketed the card anyway. When I dropped her off at her destination, she paused before getting out. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for the ride." "Thank Vernon," I replied. "He's the one who taught me that listening matters more than advice, and that second chances aren't just for people who deserve them. They're for everyone who's brave enough to try again." After she left, I sat in my car for a moment, thinking about how many people are out there right now, drowning in failure and convinced they're invisible. Thinking about how Vernon had seen me when I felt most invisible, had decided 45 minutes was enough time to build a bridge across decades of grief and loneliness and regret. I keep Vernon's business card in my wallet, the one from his final ride, slightly worn now from being carried around for over a year. On the back, in his distinctive handwriting, are the words that changed me forever. "Every ending is just a beginning waiting for brave enough hands to build it." Every time I read those words, usually on Thursday mornings before my first pickup, I whisper the same thing. "Thanks, Grandpa. And thanks for the tip." Then I turn on the app, accept the next ride, and go looking for the next person who needs to know they're not invisible. Because that's what family does. Real family, chosen family, the kind that gets built in the back of a Honda during a rainstorm when two broken people decide that maybe being broken together is better than being alone. Vernon gave me $89 million, controlling shares of a pharmaceutical company and properties I'm still discovering. But the real inheritance? It was the lesson that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And sometimes the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't money or advice or solutions. It's the simple act of seeing them, really seeing them, and deciding they matter. That's worth more than any fortune. And every Thursday morning, I get to pass it forward, one ride at a time. My wife, the CEO, announced, "I want a prenup. I'm not risking my future on you." I nodded, smart thinking. Then I had my lawyer draft one that protected everything I'd built. Her lawyers call when they realized I had 10 times more assets than she did. So there I was, Marcus Hale, 34 years old and supposedly living the dream, sitting across from my fiancée Cassandra at some bougie rooftop restaurant that charged $23 for what they called artisan bread, but what I recognized as literally just toast with butter and some fancy salt sprinkled on top. The kind of place where the waiters wear vests that cost more than my monthly car payment, and they describe every dish like it's a Netflix documentary. You know the type, where ordering a steak requires a PhD in culinary pretentiousness, and asking for ketchup gets you looks like you just announced you're voting for the other guy. The view was admittedly gorgeous, I'll give them that. The city lights sparkled below us like someone had dumped a jewelry box across the skyline. And there was this violinist wandering between tables playing something classical that I'm sure was culturally significant, but honestly just sounded like fancy background music for rich people to ignore while they Instagrammed their truffle fries. Cassandra had picked this place, naturally, because she picked everything these days. Where we ate, where we vacationed, which shade of beige our future kitchen cabinets would be. All her calls, all the time. She looked absolutely stunning that night, don't get me wrong. Her dark hair was pulled back in one of those effortlessly elegant styles that probably took 45 minutes and 3 YouTube tutorials to achieve, and she wore this emerald green dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe combined. The candlelight was doing that thing where it made her skin glow like she was lit by a professional cinematographer, and I remember thinking, yeah, okay universe, I get it. She's gorgeous. Point taken. I'd assumed we were there to celebrate. Her tech company had just gone public. IPO day, baby, and the stock had opened strong enough to make her personal shares worth something in the holy crap range of numbers. She'd been riding high all week, texting me screenshots of financial news articles with her company's name in bold, forwarding me congratulatory emails from investors and venture capitalists, basically doing everything except hiring a skywriter to announce her success. Not that I blamed her, really. She'd worked her tail off for this, pulling 80-hour weeks, living on cold brew coffee and whatever counted as food in Silicon Valley these days. She'd earned her moment. So when she reached across the table and took my hand with that smile, the one that usually preceded either really good news or really expensive purchases, I figured she was about to suggest we upgrade the honeymoon from Cabo to the Maldives, or maybe finally pull the trigger on that Tesla she'd been eyeing. I was mentally preparing my yes, dear face, maybe planning how I'd pretend to be excited about spending 2 weeks at a resort where the Wi-Fi was probably garbage. Instead, Cassandra squeezed my fingers, looked me dead in the eyes with the kind of serious expression usually reserved for cancer diagnoses or reveal that someone's been eating your leftover Chinese food, and said, "Marcus, I want a prenup. I'm not risking my future on you." I'm not even kidding. I literally almost choked on the breadstick I'd been chewing. Like, full-on sitcom-style choking, the kind where you're coughing and your eyes are watering and you're trying not to spray crumbs across the table like some kind of carb-loaded sprinkler system. The couple at the next table glanced over with that mix of concern and judgment that people reserve for public displays of mortality. I grabbed my water glass and took a gulp, buying myself maybe 10 seconds to process what had just come out of my fiancé's mouth. A prenup. She wanted a prenuptial agreement. At our celebratory dinner, with the violinist literally standing 6 feet away, playing something that was probably supposed to be romantic, but now felt like the soundtrack to a murder mystery. Now, here's the thing, I wasn't mad. I really wasn't. In fact, part of me wanted to laugh, which probably sounds insane, but stick with me here. See, Cassandra thought she was being the smart one, the practical one, the financially savvy tech executive protecting her newly minted fortune from her humble software consultant boyfriend who fixed bugs for startups and drove a beat-up SUV that made concerning noises whenever I turned left. She thought she was making a bold, independent woman move, the kind her business school professors would have applauded. What she didn't know, what nobody knew except my lawyer and my accountant and possibly my mother, though she might have forgotten because she also forgets my birthday half the time, was that I was worth significantly more than her. Like, significantly. But we'll get to that later. I set down my water glass, wiped my mouth with the fancy cloth napkin that was probably going to be laundered by hand in blessed mountain spring water or whatever, and smiled at her. Not a fake smile, either, a genuine, amused, "Oh honey, you have no idea what's about to happen" kind of smile. Smart thinking, I said, keeping my tone light and agreeable, like she'd just suggested we get appetizers. Really, Cass, that's actually brilliant. Protecting your assets, thinking long-term, being practical about the business side of marriage. Very mature. She blinked at me like I'd just complimented her on correctly identifying what color the sky was. Confusion flickered across her face for maybe half a second. I guess she'd expected pushback, maybe some wounded pride, or at least a request to discuss it later when there wasn't a violinist hovering nearby, like a tuxedoed ghost. But I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. Instead, I raised my wine glass, a Pinot Noir that the sommelier had recommended with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, and offered a toast. To protecting assets we clearly don't have the same amount of, I said cheerfully, clinking my glass against hers before she could fully process the implications of that statement. She laughed, but it was that uncertain laugh people do when they're not entirely sure if something's funny or if they're missing the joke. Spoiler alert, she was absolutely missing the joke. The joke was flying over her head at approximately Mach 3, trailing smoke and doing loop-de-loops while she sat there thinking she'd just pulled off some big power move. The rest of dinner was surreal. Cassandra launched into this detailed explanation about how her legal team, because of course she already had a legal team assembled like she was planning a corporate merger instead of a marriage, had drafted a preliminary agreement. She used phrases like spousal financial limitations and asset protection protocols and liability containment, basically turning our upcoming marriage into something that sounded like a business acquisition with slightly better catering. I nodded along, making appropriate sounds while mentally composing a text message to my own lawyer, Gina Rowe, who I'd been working with for years and who had the kind of sharp legal mind that could find loopholes in the Ten Commandments. Gina was going to absolutely lose her mind when I told her about this. She'd been waiting for Cassandra to show her true colors for months now, dropping hints like, "Your girlfriend seems very interested in your financial planning, and has she asked to see your tax returns yet?" The moment we left the restaurant. After Cassandra insisted on paying with her company credit card, naturally, making a big show of it like she was establishing dominance through overpriced C-base, I pulled out my phone. My fingers flew across the screen. Cash just asked for a prenup. Game on. Gina's response came back before I'd even made it to my car. Finally. Been waiting for this one. My office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring coffee and your sense of humor. We're going to need both. I sat in my beat-up SUV in the restaurant parking lot. The valet had given it a look like I'd asked him to park a diseased llama, and just smiled. Cassandra's Tesla was already pulling out onto the street, her taillights disappearing into downtown traffic, probably heading back to her penthouse to call her friends and brag about how she'd handled the prenup conversation like a boss babe. The game had begun, all right. She'd just started a chess match without realizing I'd been playing three-dimensional chess the entire time. But hey, I'd let her enjoy her victory lap for now. After all, the best plot twists come when people think they've already figured out the ending. I started my SUV. It made that concerning grinding noise again. Really needed to get that checked, and headed home to my modest little condo with my modest little life, already planning my next move. Tomorrow morning, Gina and I were going to draft a prenup of our own. Only ours was going to have some very interesting clauses that I had a feeling Cassandra wasn't going to see coming. This was going to be fun. Here's the thing about perception versus reality. Most people only see what you want them to see, and I'd become a freaking Jedi master at controlling that narrative. To everyone in my life, including Cassandra and her entire circle of power-suited, kombucha-drinking, TED Talk-watching friends, I was just Marcus Hale, the reliable but ultimately unremarkable software consultant who fixed code for startups and lived a comfortable but decidedly average existence. You know the type. Shows up to work in jeans and a hoodie, orders the same turkey club for lunch 3 times a week, drives a vehicle that's held together by duct tape and prayer, the kind of guy who blends into the background at parties while more interesting people talk about their vacations to Croatia. They saw a guy who made decent money, sure, enough to split fancy dinners and contribute to a wedding fund without crying into his bank statement, but nothing spectacular. Nothing that would make anyone sit up and take notice or suddenly develop opinions about how I should invest, or what I should be driving, or whether I'd consider diversifying my portfolio. I was financially comfortable in the most boring, middle-class way possible, like a human equivalent of a Toyota Camry. Reliable, functional, completely forgettable. What Cassandra didn't know, what literally nobody except my lawyer Gina, my accountant Harold, and probably the IRS knew, was that 3 years ago, I'd quietly sold a piece of software that I'd built in my spare time for $18.6 million. And yeah, you read that right. $18.6 million. Plus royalties that kept rolling in every quarter like clockwork, adding a nice little bonus to my bank account that would make most people's annual salary look like tip money. The software was a cloud-based AI system for logistics management. Basically, a really smart tool that helped companies figure out the most efficient ways to move products from point A to point B while saving money and reducing their carbon footprint and making their supply chain managers look like geniuses. I'd started building it about 6 years ago when I was working for a mid-sized tech company and got frustrated with how clunky and outdated all the existing logistics software was. It was like watching someone try to run a marathon in wooden clogs. Technically possible, but painfully inefficient and just sad to witness. So I did what any self-respecting engineer with too much time and too much coffee does. I built something better. Nights, weekends, lunch breaks, those weird hours between 2 and 5 a.m. when you can't sleep and your brain decides it's the perfect time to solve complex algorithmic problems. I coded and tested and refined, living off energy drinks and the kind of takeout food that arrives in styrofoam containers with mysterious sauces. My friends thought I was going through some kind of quarter-life crisis. My mom thought I needed a girlfriend. Nobody realized I was building something that would eventually change my life completely. The beauty of the system was that it was genuinely useful. Within 6 months of soft launching it, half the startups in the city were using it. Within a year, I had clients in 15 states. Within 18 months, a major investment firm came knocking with an offer that made my hands shake when I read the number. They wanted to buy it outright, integrate it into their portfolio of business solutions, and pay me not just a massive lump sum, but also ongoing royalties based on usage and licensing. I remember sitting in that conference room with their acquisition team, all of them in suits that cost more than my rent, and thinking, holy hell, this is actually happening. My lawyer Gino was there, of course, negotiating terms like a boss and making sure I didn't accidentally sign away my firstborn or agree to anything stupid. When we finally shook hands and signed the paperwork, I walked out of that building a legitimately wealthy man. Not, I can afford a nicer apartment wealthy, but I could retire tomorrow and live comfortably for the rest of my life wealthy. And then I did something that apparently nobody does when they suddenly come into money. I kept my mouth shut and my lifestyle exactly the same. I didn't buy a Porsche or a penthouse or start wearing watches that cost more than college tuition. I didn't suddenly develop a taste for caviar or feel the need to vacation in places where you need a passport and a translator. I stayed in my modest 2-bedroom condo in a perfectly average neighborhood where the biggest drama was usually someone leaving their garbage cans out too long. I kept driving my beat-up SUV that made alarming noises and had a mysterious stain on the back seat that I'd stopped trying to identify. I still bought my coffee at the regular coffee shop instead of the pretentious one with the foam art. And I still wore the same jeans and t-shirts I'd been wearing since college. Because honestly, why the hell not? Here's what I'd learned from watching other people come into money. The moment everyone knows you have it, your life becomes exponentially more complicated. Suddenly, you've got long-lost cousins remembering your birthday, friends with amazing investment opportunities that sound suspiciously like pyramid schemes, and romantic partners who are suddenly very interested in discussing your financial future together. Money doesn't just change your bank account. It changes how everyone around you behaves, and not usually in good ways. The last time someone had found out I had any significant amount of money, this was years ago, before the big sale, when I'd made a decent bonus from a consulting gig, they'd suddenly become allergic to splitting the bill. Every dinner became this awkward dance of, oh no, you get this one, followed by them never, ever reaching for their wallet again. They'd gotten weird about it. Entitled, almost, like my slightly larger bank balance meant I was now the designated patron saint of picking up tabs. It was exhausting and irritating, and it killed the friendship faster than you could say Venmo request. So when the big money came through, I made a conscious decision to keep living like regular Marcus, the forgettable software guy who was doing okay, but nothing spectacular. I took on occasional consulting gigs to maintain the appearance of needing to work. Showed up to meetings with my old laptop that had stickers from conferences nobody remembered, and generally played the part of a guy who was comfortable but not wealthy. And it worked beautifully. Cassandra absolutely loved being the successful one in our relationship. It fed something in her ego that I didn't fully understand but was happy to accommodate because, honestly, it made my life easier. She paid for the fancy dinners and bragged to her friends about her hotshot career and treated me like her charming but financially inferior partner, the guy who was successful enough to not be embarrassing but not so successful that he threatened her position as the alpha earner. I was her safe, supportive, slightly beneath her boyfriend, and she wore that dynamic like a designer handbag. I let her have it. Why? Because watching someone underestimate you is actually kind of hilarious, and also because I genuinely didn't need the spotlight. Let her have her moment. Let her feel like the boss. I was perfectly content being underestimated, living my quiet life, making my quiet money, and not having to deal with the circus that comes with everyone knowing your net worth. But then her prenup arrived in my inbox, forwarded from her lawyer's office with a subject line that read premarital agreement, review and response requested. I opened it during my lunch break, sitting at my desk with a sandwich that I'd made at home, because spending $12 on lunch seemed wasteful even with millions in the bank, and started reading through the clauses. No alimony. Return the engagement ring if the marriage dissolves within 5 years. Spousal financial limits on joint accounts. separate property designations, liability waivers. It read less like a marriage agreement and more like a corporate contract designed to protect a company from a hostile takeover. Every clause basically screamed, "I have money and you don't, so let's make sure you can't touch mine." I laughed so hard that coffee came out my nose, legitimately shot out like a caffeinated geyser, spraying across my keyboard and making my coworker in the next cubicle ask if I was okay. I was more than okay. I was delighted. This was the most entertainment I'd had in months. I forwarded the entire document to Gina with a simple message. She really did it. Thoughts? Her response came back within minutes, and I could practically hear her cackling through the phone. "Oh, sweetheart, this is Christmas morning. We're drafting one too. Only ours will have fireworks, confetti, and a surprise ending that'll make her lawyer need therapy. Clear your schedule for tomorrow. We've got work to do." I sat back in my office chair, grinning like an idiot, watching my coworkers mill around discussing their mundane problems, printer jams, meeting conflicts, whether the office thermostat was set too cold. None of them had any idea that the quiet guy in the corner cubicle was about to flip his entire relationship dynamic on its head. The game wasn't just beginning anymore. The pieces were in position, and Cassandra had just made the opening move in a chess match she didn't realize she was already losing. Cassandra showed up at my condo that evening unannounced, which was pretty typical for her these days since she'd started treating my place like an extension of her own personal empire. I heard her heels clicking up the hallway before she even knocked. These sharp, staccato sounds that announced her presence like a corporate drummer leading a parade of ambition and designer handbags. She had a key, of course, but she always knocked first, which I'd initially thought was respectful until I realized it was actually her way of giving me a 3-second warning to look appropriately grateful for her arrival. I opened the door to find her standing there in full boardroom regalia despite it being 7:30 on a Wednesday night. She was wearing this tailored navy pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. Her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail that must have required industrial-strength product to achieve that level of perfection, and she was absolutely radiating the kind of confidence that comes from spending your day telling people what to do and having them actually do it. She also smelled incredible, some perfume that I'm pretty sure cost more than my car's current blue book value, something with notes of jasmine and financial superiority. She kissed me on the cheek, a gesture that felt more like a queen acknowledging a loyal subject than a fiancé greeting her future husband, and breezed past me into my living room like she owned the place. Which, given the prenup she was proposing, she wanted to make very clear she didn't and never would. "Marcus," she said, settling onto my couch with the kind of graceful efficiency that made everything look choreographed. "I'm really glad you're being so mature about the prenup situation. A lot of men would have gotten defensive or emotional, but you're handling it with such grace. It's very attractive, honestly. Shows real emotional intelligence." I nodded along, playing my role perfectly, the understanding boyfriend who knew his place in the financial hierarchy. "Well, you know me," I said, keeping my tone light and agreeable. "I'm all about practical solutions and thinking long-term. Marriage is a partnership, and partnerships need clear agreements." She smiled, genuinely smiled, like I'd just passed some kind of test she'd been administering without telling me. "Exactly. That's exactly what I told my team." I said, "Marcus gets it. He understands that this is just good business sense. You're not like other guys who get all weird about money and pride and masculinity." I sat down in the armchair across from her, the one with the slightly worn cushion that I'd been meaning to replace for about 2 years, but kept forgetting about because, honestly, it was comfortable and I didn't care that it didn't match the rest of my furniture. "Actually," I said, letting the word hang in the air for just a moment, "I thought it was such a good idea that I asked my lawyer to prepare one too." The change in her expression was subtle but absolutely priceless. Her smile froze, not disappeared, just froze, like someone had hit pause on a video right in the middle of an animation. Her perfectly groomed eyebrows, which probably required monthly maintenance appointments and specialized tools, drew together slightly in confusion. "Wait," she said slowly, processing this information like a computer trying to run software it wasn't equipped for. "You have a lawyer?" "Yeah," I said casually, like I was mentioning that I had a dentist or a guy who fixed my plumbing when it got weird. "Gina Rowe. I've been working with her for a few years now." She handles all my contract stuff, legal questions, boring paperwork things. She's fantastic, cheaper than therapy, and twice as fun to talk to." Cassandra laughed, but it was one of those laughs that people do when they're not entirely sure what's happening, but they want to seem like they're in on the joke. It came out a little forced, a little artificial, like artificial sweetener trying to pass as sugar. "That's great," she said, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head, trying to figure out why a simple software consultant would need a lawyer on retainer for contract stuff. "So you're drafting your own prenup too?" "Well, Gina is," I clarified, being helpful. "I'm not exactly fluent in legal jargon. I mostly just tell her what I want, and she translates it into the kind of language that makes sense in court. She's really good at it." Went to Columbia Law, clerked for a federal judge, worked at one of those big Manhattan firms before deciding she preferred working with actual humans instead of corporate robots. We got connected through a mutual friend a few years back, and she's been invaluable ever since. I could see Cassandra trying to process this information, trying to fit it into her existing mental model of who I was and what my life looked like. In her mind, I was supposed to be the guy who maybe asked a buddy who knew a buddy who was in law school for advice, not someone who had an actual established attorney relationship with a Columbia-educated lawyer who'd worked at prestigious firms. It didn't compute with her narrative. "That's very thorough of you," she finally said, recovering her composure with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years in boardrooms where showing confusion was basically admitting weakness. "I mean, I'm sure your prenup will be fairly straightforward. You know, just covering the basics." "Oh, I'm sure," I agreed cheerfully. "Gina's very thorough, though. She likes to make sure all the bases are covered, every detail accounted for. She actually got pretty excited when I told her about your prenup. Said something about how it was going to be fun to draft proper counterproposals. I think she likes the challenge, you know, like a puzzle or a chess game." Cassandra's smile was getting tighter now, less genuine, more of a professional mask she was maintaining out of habit. "Well, I'm sure our lawyers will work well together. Dalton, that's my attorney, is very experienced with these matters. He handles prenups for half the tech executives in the city." "That's perfect then," I said, all sunshine and cooperation. Gina loves working with experienced attorneys. She says it makes everything go faster when everyone knows what they're doing. She mentioned we should probably do a full financial disclosure on both sides, just to make sure everything's transparent and above board. Standard procedure, apparently. That word, disclosure, hung in the air between us like a smoke alarm that had just started beeping. I watched Cassandra's face carefully, saw the tiniest flicker of something that might have been concern or maybe just curiosity. She thought she knew everything about my financial situation because I'd been so carefully average in her presence, so consistently unimpressive in my displays of wealth. The idea that there might be something to disclose beyond software consultant makes decent salary probably seemed absurd to her. "Of course," she said smoothly, already pulling out her phone, probably to text Dalton about this unexpected development. "Transparency is important. Although I imagine your disclosure will be pretty straightforward, salary, savings, maybe a 401k. Dalton can have his paralegal whip up the standard forms." "Probably," I agreed, not correcting her adorable misconceptions. Gina said she'd have everything ready by next week. She's very efficient. I think you'll like her, actually. She's got that same kind of direct, no-nonsense energy you have. Very professional, very sharp. Cassandra stayed for another 40 minutes, during which she talked about her company's stock performance, an upcoming board meeting, and some corporate drama involving a VP who'd made the mistake of questioning her strategy in front of investors. I made the appropriate listening noises, asked the right questions, played the supportive partner role perfectly. The whole time, though, I was mentally counting down the hours until my meeting with Gina tomorrow morning, where we were going to craft a prenup that would make Cassandra's fancy lawyer earn whatever astronomical hourly rate he was charging. After she left, another cheek kiss, another cloud of expensive perfume, another reminder that she had an early meeting tomorrow, so she couldn't stay over. I immediately texted Gina. She has no idea. This is going to be spectacular. Her response was almost instantaneous. Already drafting. Bringing my A game. We're adding full financial disclosure requirements, asset verification protocols, and a few fun clauses about good faith negotiations. If Madam CEO wants to play lawyer ball, we're We're bringing the entire legal league. Also, I'm putting in a clause about honesty in relationships. Just for the irony. I grinned at my phone like an idiot. Make it sparkle. I typed back. Oh honey, she replied. I'm about to make it shine like a disco ball at a billionaire's wedding. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we're going to create a legal document so beautiful it should be in a museum. Also, bring good coffee. The stuff in my office tastes like filtered sadness. I spent the rest of the evening in a genuinely good mood, ordering pizza from my regular place. The one with the slightly greasy boxes and the guy at the counter who always gave me extra garlic knots, and watching basketball highlights while my cat, Chairman Meow. Yes, I named my cat Chairman Meow, sue me. Judged me from his perch on the bookshelf. Cassandra thought she was playing chess, making strategic moves, protecting her assets like a good CEO. What she didn't realize was that she'd just walked into a game where she didn't even know all the pieces on the board. Tomorrow morning, Gina and I were going to change that. We were going to put all the pieces in plain view, spread them out on the table, and watch what happened when Cassandra realized that her slightly dorky, financially unremarkable fiancé was actually playing a completely different game than she thought. I couldn't wait. The law office was located in one of those downtown buildings that screamed, "We charge by the minute and our coffee is imported," all glass and chrome and architectural angles that looked like someone had given MC Escher a blank check and told him to go crazy. The lobby had that polished marble floor that made your footsteps echo importantly, like every step you took was being documented for posterity or at least for someone's Instagram story about power moves and professional success. The whole place smelled like expensive wood polish, fresh leather, and the kind of quiet money that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone already knows it's there. Gina had suggested we meet at Dalton's office as a courtesy, which I thought was hilarious because there was nothing courteous about what we were about to do. It was like a boxer suggesting you choose which ring you want to get knocked out in. Technically polite, ultimately irrelevant. She'd shown up at my place that morning in a sharp black suit that meant business, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it could survive a nuclear apocalypse and still have room for highlighters, and she'd been grinning like someone who'd just been told Christmas was coming early this year. Ready to ruin someone's whole narrative? She'd asked cheerfully while I locked my apartment door. Born ready, I'd replied, and I meant it. We arrived exactly on time. Gina was big on punctuality as a power move, said it showed you respected everyone's time while also establishing that you were organized and professional, and were ushered into a conference room that looked like it had been designed specifically to intimidate people into settling. The table was this massive slab of dark wood that probably cost more than a decent used car, surrounded by leather chairs that made important creaking noises when you sat in them, and one entire wall was floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city that basically screamed, "Look how successful everyone in this room is." Cassandra was already there, of course, because she'd probably arrived 15 minutes early to establish territorial dominance. She was wearing a white power suit that was so crisp and bright it could probably be seen from space, paired with these killer heels that added 3 inches to her height and about 50 points to her intimidation factor. Her hair was pulled back in a style that said, "I woke up like this," but actually meant, "I woke up 2 hours early to look like this." And her makeup was flawless in that way that takes significant time and skill to achieve while appearing natural. She looked like she'd stepped out of a Fortune 500 cover shoot, which was probably the exact vibe she was going for. Her lawyer, Mr. Dalton, sat beside her looking equally polished and approximately 3 times as smug. He was one of those silver-haired attorney types who probably played golf with judges on weekends and owned multiple vacation homes that he referred to as the place in Aspen or the Cape House, like everyone just automatically knew which Cape he meant. His suit probably cost what I used to make in a month back in my actual struggling software consultant days, and he wore a watch that looked like it could fund a small nation's GDP. He had that expression that expensive lawyers get when they think they've already won. This sort of benevolent condescension, like a cat that's already caught the mouse and is just playing with it for entertainment value. "Marcus," Cassandra said warmly, standing to kiss my cheek in that performance of affection that I'd grown accustomed to. "Thank you for being so reasonable about all this. Mr. Dalton has prepared everything beautifully." "I'm sure he has," I said pleasantly, taking a seat across from them. Gina settled in beside me with the kind of calm confidence that made me want to high-five her. She set her briefcase on the table with a satisfying thud that said, "We're here, and we mean business." Dalton cleared his throat importantly, the way people do when they're about to say something they think is significant. "Shall we begin with Ms. Reeves's financial disclosure? I think you'll find everything is quite in order." He slid a leather portfolio across the table toward us like he was presenting evidence at trial. "My client has been remarkably transparent about her assets." Gina opened the portfolio with the casual interest of someone browsing a restaurant menu, flipping through pages while I pretended to be fascinated by the view outside. The disclosure was thorough, I'll give them that. Cassandra's company shares, current valuation, her penthouse lease details, the loan on her Tesla, her investment accounts, her savings. Everything laid out in neat columns with official letterheads and verification stamps. It was the financial equivalent of peacock feathers, all spread out for maximum impressive display. "Very comprehensive," Gina said approvingly, closing the portfolio. "My client appreciates the thoroughness. Mr. Dalton, you have an excellent reputation, and this work reflects that." Dalton actually preened a little, puffing up like he'd just been told his kid made honor roll. "Well, we do pride ourselves on attention to detail. I've handled prenuptial agreements for some of the most prominent executives in the city, and I believe in complete transparency as the foundation of any solid marital contract." "Transparency," Gina repeated, nodding thoughtfully. "Yes, that's so important. Which is exactly why we've prepared Mr. Hale's disclosure with the same level of detail." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a binder. Not a slim portfolio like Cassandra's, but an actual thick binder, the kind you'd use for a doctoral thesis or a comprehensive business plan. She set it on the table between us, and I swear to God, it made an audible thud that seemed to echo in the suddenly very quiet conference room. "Here are Mr. Hale's financials," Gina said pleasantly, sliding the binder across the polished wood toward Dalton and Cassandra. "As you'll see, we've been quite thorough." I watched Dalton's face as he opened the binder, and it was absolutely worth the price of admission to this whole circus. His expression went from smugly confident to confused to completely frozen in the span of about 4 seconds, which might be a record for emotional whiplash in legal proceedings. His eyes scanned the first page, then widened, then scanned again like he thought he might have misread something. The color drained from his face in a way that would have been concerning if it wasn't so entertaining. Cassandra leaned over to look, her perfectly manicured hand reaching out to turn the page, and I got to watch in real time as her brain tried to process what she was seeing. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again like a fish that had suddenly found itself on dry land and wasn't quite sure how that had happened. The confident boardroom executive expression she'd been wearing like armor just crumbled. "Marcus," she said, and her voice came out weird, strangled, like she was trying to speak while someone was stepping on her throat. "You're worth 8 figures?" I took a sip of the water that someone had helpfully placed at each seat, probably imported from some Norwegian glacier or filtered through diamonds or something equally ridiculous, and smiled. "Technically 9 if you count the royalties," I said casually, like we were discussing the weather or sports scores. "They've been performing really well lately. The Q3 numbers just came in, and they were pretty solid." Dalton was flipping through pages now, his silver hair practically standing on end as he encountered document after document. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds I'd forgotten I owned, the original sale agreement from my software company, royalty statements, tax returns that would make most people's eyes water. Each page was meticulously documented, verified, notarized, and completely legitimate. Gina didn't mess around when it came to paperwork. This is quite extensive," Dalton stammered, and watching a lawyer who probably charged $800 an hour struggle to form coherent sentences was honestly therapeutic. "Mr. Hale, your financial position is significantly more robust than we were led to believe." "Nobody led you to believe anything," I pointed out reasonably. "You just assumed. There's a difference." Cassandra was still staring at the binder like it was written in ancient hieroglyphics, and she was trying to decode some message from a lost civilization. Her face had gone through several color changes, from her normal healthy glow to pale to slightly flushed to a shade that I can only describe as, "Oh crap, I've made a terrible mistake." Her mascara, which had probably been applied with the precision of a surgeon this morning, was starting to smudge slightly at the corners where I'm pretty sure she was fighting back tears. Not sad tears. Angry, frustrated, embarrassed tears. The kind you get when you realize you've completely misjudged a situation and there's an audience watching. You deceived me, she said finally, and there was an edge to her voice that could have cut glass. You've been lying this whole time about who you are, what you have. You let me think. I let you think what you wanted to think. I interrupted gently but firmly. I never lied to you, Cass. Not once. You asked me what I did for a living. I told you, software consultant. True. You asked if I owned my condo. I said yes. Also true. You never asked if I had other assets or investments or income streams. You just assumed that what you saw was all there was. Gina jumped in, her voice professional and crisp. Mr. Hale has been completely forthcoming when asked direct questions. He simply chose not to volunteer information that wasn't requested. There's no legal or ethical violation there. In fact, I'd argue it shows remarkable restraint in an era where everyone feels compelled to broadcast their entire financial situation on social media. Dalton was regrouping now, his lawyer brain kicking back into gear despite the shock. We may need a moment to review these documents more thoroughly, he said, trying to salvage some professional dignity. This changes the parameters of the prenuptial negotiation significantly. Take all the time you need, I said generously, standing up and buttoning my jacket. Not a fancy jacket, just my regular one from a department store that had a sale, which now felt like an extra layer of irony. We're not going anywhere. Well, actually, we are going to grab lunch, but we'll be back in an hour. There's a great taco place around the corner that does amazing carnitas. Gina, you hungry? Starving, Gina said, gathering up her things with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won the opening round of a championship match. I looked at Cassandra, who was still frozen in her chair, staring at the financial documents like they might spontaneously combust if she looked hard enough. Oh, and Cass, I said, pausing at the door. Remember what you said at dinner? About not risking your future on me. I smiled, keeping my tone light and friendly. Yeah, I feel the same way. See you in an hour. We walked out of that conference room into the marble lobby, and the moment the elevator doors closed, Gina burst out laughing, deep, genuine belly laughs that had her leaning against the elevator wall for support. Did you see her face? She gasped between laughs. Did you see Dalton's face? I thought he was going to have a cardiac event right there in his own conference room. I grinned. Worth every penny of your hourly rate. Honey, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. This one's on the house. That was pure entertainment. That night, my phone started blowing up around 8 p.m., which was honestly later than I'd expected. I'd figured Cassandra would start the text assault the moment she got back to her penthouse, probably around 6:30, but apparently it took her a solid 90 minutes to work herself up into the kind of rage that demanded immediate digital confrontation. I was sitting on my couch in sweatpants and an old college t-shirt that had more holes than Swiss cheese, eating leftover Chinese food straight from the container like a functional adult, when my phone started vibrating so aggressively it nearly fell off the coffee table. The first text simply said, "Call me. Now." All caps on that, now, which in text message language is basically the equivalent of someone kicking down your door and demanding attention. I took another bite of cold lo mein, chewed thoughtfully, and decided that I was comfortable right where I was. Thank you very much. Chairman Meow was purring on the other end of the couch, completely unbothered by human drama, living his best life, and I figured I should take notes from his zen approach to conflict. The second text came 30 seconds later. Marcus, we need to talk about what happened today. I wiped my hands on a napkin, not because I was going to respond, just because General Tso's sauce on phone screens is a pain to clean, and watched as the three little dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. She was typing, deleting, retyping, probably going through 17 different versions of whatever she wanted to say, trying to find the right combination of words that would make this situation make sense to her. The third text arrived, and it was a doozy. You deceived me. I couldn't help it. I actually laughed out loud, startling Chairman Meow, who gave me a reproachful look that cats have perfected over thousands of years of judging humanity. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're absolutely, completely in the right. You said you wanted transparency. I just turned on the lights. I could practically feel the rage radiating through the phone screen from wherever she was. The response came back fast and furious. You know that's not what I meant. You made me look like a fool. How? I typed back, genuinely curious about her logic here. By having money? By being successful? By not broadcasting my net worth on the first date? Please explain which part of having my life together makes you look foolish. The typing dots appeared and disappeared for a solid 2 minutes. I finished my lo mein, cracked open a beer. Nothing fancy, just regular domestic beer that came in a 6-pack from the grocery store, and waited. This was actually kind of entertaining in a train wreck sort of way, like watching a reality show where you know exactly how it's going to end, but you can't look away. Finally, her response came through, and it was long enough that it arrived in multiple texts. That thing that happens when someone is so worked up they don't realize they're writing a novel. You embarrassed me in front of my lawyer. Do you have any idea how that looked? I brought him documentation of my success, my achievements, and then you show up with some massive binder like you were planning this ambush the whole time. Dalton called me after you left, and he was shocked. He said in 20 years of practice, he's never seen such a discrepancy between perceived and actual financial positions. I sat back, took a swig of beer, and considered my response options. I could be mature and sympathetic, try to see things from her perspective, maybe offer some kind of olive branch that would smooth things over. Or I could be honest, which seemed like the more entertaining and ultimately more productive option. I went with honest. Cassandra, I typed, I didn't embarrass you. You embarrassed yourself. You assumed that because I don't drive a Porsche or wear a Rolex or live in a penthouse, I must not have money. That's on you. You wanted a prenup to protect your assets from me, like I was some kind of gold digger waiting to cash in. The only thing I did was show you that maybe you should have asked a few more questions before you made assumptions. The response was almost immediate. You should have told me. Why? I shot back. So you could treat me differently? So you could change how you acted around me? The whole reason I don't advertise my net worth is because money makes people weird. Case in point, this conversation. 3 minutes of silence. I could imagine her in her pristine penthouse with its minimalist furniture and city views, pacing around in whatever expensive loungewear rich people wear at home, probably drinking wine from a glass that cost more than my couch, trying to figure out how to regain the upper hand in a situation where she'd definitively lost it. The next text was different in tone, less angry, more accusatory. You lied by omission. That's still lying. No, I replied. Lying is saying something untrue. I never said I was broke. I never said I struggled financially. I never claimed to be anything other than what I am. You created a story in your head about who I was based on superficial observations, and now you're mad that your story was wrong. That's not my problem. That's yours. My phone actually rang then, her name flashing on the screen with a photo of her from our trip to Napa last year, back when things were simpler and she hadn't tried to legally protect herself from my supposed financial inadequacy. I let it go to voicemail. Whatever she wanted to say could wait until she'd calmed down enough to have an actual conversation instead of just yelling accusations into the void. The voicemail notification popped up within seconds. I didn't listen to it. Instead, I sent another text. I'm not doing the phone fight thing tonight. When you're ready to have an actual adult conversation about this, let me know. Until then, I'm going to finish my Chinese food and watch the game. Her response was a single word. Unbelievable. Right back at you. I typed, and then I did something that probably would have given my mother a heart attack if she'd known. I muted the conversation and turned my attention back to the basketball game that had been playing in the background. The Celtics were up by 12 and playing some genuinely beautiful ball, and honestly, that was a lot more interesting than Cassandra's existential crisis about dating someone who turned out to have more money than she did. But she wasn't done, oh no. Over the next 2 hours, my phone lit up with notifications that I couldn't read because I'd muted them, but I could see the count increasing. By the time I decided to actually check what had happened, there were 17 more messages, each one apparently more dramatic than the last based on their increasing length. I unmuted the conversation and scrolled through the saga. It was like watching someone have a full breakdown via text message, starting with anger, moving through justification, taking a detour through self-righteousness, and eventually landing at a weird place that seemed to be part accusation, part self-pity, and part demand for validation. The highlights included, you know I've worked hard for everything I have, which, fair, but irrelevant. My friends are going to ask questions now, which, not my problem. Dalton said we need to completely redraft both prenups. Which, yeah, duh. And finally, I don't even know who you are anymore. Which was particularly hilarious because I was exactly the same person I'd always been. She just finally knew my bank balance. I responded to all 17 messages with one simple text. I'm the same guy who fixed your laptop when you spilled coffee on it, who listened to you talk about quarterly earnings for 3 hours straight, who supported your IPO dreams, and who never once made you feel bad about making more money than me. Or so you thought. The only thing that's changed is your perception. Maybe sit with that for a while. Her response came 30 seconds later. This isn't over. Probably not, I agreed. But it's over for tonight. Get some sleep, Cass. You've got that board meeting tomorrow, and you're going to need to be sharp. I didn't wait for her response. I plugged my phone in across the room, a trick I'd learned from a self-help article about digital boundaries, and settled back into my couch cushions. Chairman Meow had forgiven me for the earlier disruption and was now sprawled across my lap like a furry, judgmental blanket. The thing about Cassandra's meltdown was that it wasn't really about me hiding money or even about the prenup. It was about control, about narrative, about her carefully constructed image of our relationship, where she was the successful one and I was the supportive, but ultimately lesser partner. I disrupted that story, flipped the script without warning, and now she was scrambling to rewrite the narrative in a way that made sense to her worldview. But here's what she didn't get, what she probably would never get. I didn't care about being the richest person in the relationship. I didn't need to be the provider or the alpha earner or whatever corporate buzzword she wanted to use. I was perfectly happy being equals, or letting her think she was ahead, or whatever dynamic made her feel good about herself. The problem wasn't that I had money. It was that she'd wanted a prenup specifically to protect herself from me, had basically declared that I was a financial liability she needed legal protection from, and then got mad when it turned out I wasn't what she'd assumed. That's not my character flaw. That's hers. I fell asleep on the couch that night with the game still playing quietly in the background and my phone blessedly silent across the room. Tomorrow would probably bring more drama, more accusations, more attempts to make me the villain in a story where I'd literally done nothing wrong except be successful while dressing like I shopped at Target. But tonight? Tonight I was just a guy with good Chinese food, a judgmental cat, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the best move in chess is the one your opponent never sees coming. The invitation to Cassandra's apartment came the next evening via text, which was interesting because she'd spent most of the day giving me the silent treatment. Or at least I assumed she had, since my phone had been blissfully quiet except for work emails and a reminder from my dentist about an upcoming cleaning. The text was formal, almost businesslike. Can you come over tonight at 7? We need to talk. Some of my friends will be here too. That last sentence should have been my first red flag, maybe my second and third too, but I was curious enough about what kind of ambush she was planning that I agreed. I showed up exactly on time because punctuality is my superpower, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that I'd iron myself because I'm a functional adult who owns an iron, even if I only use it maybe 4 times a year. The building doorman knew me by now and waved me through with a knowing look that suggested he'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. I took the elevator up to the 15th floor, listening to smooth jazz that was supposed to be calming, but really just made me think about dental offices and corporate lobbies. Cassandra opened the door before I could knock, which meant she'd probably been watching the elevator camera feed like a hawk. She was wearing casual clothes. Well, her version of casual, which meant designer yoga pants that probably cost $300 and a silk blouse that looked effortless but definitely wasn't. Her hair was down, which was unusual for her, and she wasn't wearing the full makeup armor she usually had on. For a moment, I almost felt bad about the whole situation. Almost. Marcus, she said, and her tone was neutral, carefully controlled, like she'd been practicing in the mirror. Thanks for coming. Everyone's in the living room. Everyone turned out to be 3 of her closest friends, the corporate wolf pack she ran with. All successful women in their 30s who wore ambition like perfume and treated brunch like a strategic planning session. There was Tina, her PR manager, a sharp-featured blonde who could spin a company scandal into a feel-good story before you finished your morning coffee. Jessica, her college roommate turned venture capitalist, who evaluated people the way normal people evaluated restaurant menus, quickly and with definite opinions about value. And Rebecca, her former boss turned business partner, a woman who'd made her first million before 30 and never let anyone forget it. They were arranged in Cassandra's living room like a tribunal, sitting on her expensive minimalist furniture with glasses of wine that probably cost more per bottle than my monthly utility bill. The whole scene had the vibe of an intervention, except instead of concerned family members worried about substance abuse, it was corporate warriors concerned about what, exactly? Their friend dating someone who turned out to have money? The logic was already breaking down. "Marcus," said Tina, and she didn't stand up or offer a handshake, just acknowledged my existence with the kind of cool assessment that PR people perfect over years of managing crises. "We're worried. We wanted to talk to you about the situation with Cassandra." I looked at Cassandra, who was suddenly very interested in her wine glass, then back at Tina. "The situation," I repeated slowly, like I was trying out a new vocabulary word. "You mean the situation where I have money and didn't announce it on a billboard?" "That situation." Jessica leaned forward, her venture capitalist brain clearly running some kind of calculation. "It's not about the money, Marcus. It's about transparency. Relationships require honesty, and you weren't honest about your financial position." I pulled out one of Cassandra's dining chairs. A sleek, uncomfortable piece of designer furniture that looked great but felt like sitting on a slightly padded board, and sat down facing them. "Okay, let's do this properly then. What specifically was I dishonest about? And I want actual examples, not vague feelings." Rebecca jumped in, clearly the designated attack dog of the group. "You let Cassandra believe you were just a regular consultant. You drove a beat-up car, lived in a modest apartment, never mentioned having significant assets. That's deceptive by omission." "Cool," I said, nodding like I was really considering her point. "So by that logic, should I have also told her my childhood fears, my medical history, and my browser search history on the first date? Where exactly is the line between privacy and deception?" Because from where I'm sitting, I answered every question I was asked honestly. I just didn't volunteer information that wasn't requested. "That's not the same thing," Tina interjected, her PR instincts kicking in. "Financial disclosure is fundamental to building a life partnership. You had to know that information was relevant." I smiled, and I could feel it wasn't a particularly nice smile. "You know what's really interesting about this conversation? 3 months ago, Cassandra told me, and I quote, 'I love that you're not intimidated by my success. So many men have fragile egos about dating a woman who makes more money.' She literally praised me for being comfortable in what she thought was a lesser financial position. So which is it? Should I have been insecure about her making more, or should I have announced I actually made more? Because I can't win both ways." The room went quiet for a beat. Cassandra was staring at her wine like it might contain the answers to life's mysteries if she looked hard enough. Her friends exchanged glances, that silent communication thing that groups of women do when they're recalibrating their strategy mid-conversation. "The point is," Rebecca tried again, clearly not ready to give up, "you made Cassandra look like a fool. She brought her lawyer financial disclosures thinking she was the primary earner, and you blindsided her with your actual net worth. That's humiliating." "Okay, I'm going to stop you right there," I said, and my tone was still conversational, but there was an edge to it now. I didn't make Cassandra look like anything. She made assumptions based on superficial observations, my car, my apartment, my clothes, and those assumptions turned out to be wrong. That's not me humiliating her. That's her humiliating herself by judging a book by its cover and then being surprised when the book had more pages than she expected. "You could have corrected those assumptions," Jessica pointed out, playing the reasonable card. "Why?" I asked genuinely. Why was it my job to correct her assumptions? When someone assumes I'm younger than I am, or taller than I am, or from a different state than I'm actually from, I don't feel obligated to immediately correct them unless it's relevant. My bank balance wasn't relevant to our relationship until she made it relevant by demanding a prenup specifically designed to protect her money from me. Tina set down her wine glass with a deliberate clink. "You don't understand the pressure she's under, Marcus. She's a CEO now. She has a public image to maintain, shareholders to answer to, a reputation in the tech community. Having her personal life become fodder for gossip because her fiancé turned out to be secretly wealthy." Wait, wait, I interrupted, holding up my hand. "Let me get this straight. You're mad at me because I have money, but you're framing it as concern about gossip? If I was actually broke like she thought, would there be gossip?" No. If I was wealthy and flashy about it from the start, would there be gossip? Maybe, but it would be different gossip. The only reason there's any potential for gossip is because Cassandra made a very public assumption about our financial dynamic and got it wrong. That's on her. You're being deliberately obtuse, Rebecca said, and there was real anger in her voice now. You know that appearances matter in our world. You know that Cassandra's carefully built a brand around being a strong, independent, successful woman. You undermining that. I didn't undermine anything, I said, and my voice got a little louder despite my best efforts to stay calm. I literally supported every single thing she did. I cheered her on through her IPO. I listened to her talk about business strategy for hours. I never once made her feel small or inadequate or less successful. The only thing I didn't do was announce my net worth, and the only reason that's a problem now is because she wanted to legally protect herself from me like I was some kind of financial threat. You want to know what's really wild? I was one of the early investors in her company. My money literally helped build the foundation of her success, and she had no idea. That landed like a bomb in the middle of the room. All four women froze, wine glasses suspended midair, faces registering shock in varying degrees. Cassandra's face went from pale to red so fast I worried about her blood pressure. What? Cassandra whispered, and her voice was barely audible. Yeah, I said, leaning back in the uncomfortable designer chair. 3 years ago, when you were looking for seed funding and nobody was biting because your pitch deck was rough and you didn't have a prototype yet. Remember that anonymous investor who came through with $50,000? The one your original partner said was a friend of a friend who believed in the vision? That was me. I believed in you, Cassandra. I believed in your idea and your drive and your potential. I gave you money, my money, to help you build your dream. And I never told you because I didn't want it to change anything between us. Jessica had her phone out now, probably already looking up public investment records. Tina looked like she was mentally composing a PR statement. Rebecca just stared at me like I'd grown a second head. And Cassandra looked like she might actually cry, which would have been satisfying if it wasn't also kind of sad. So let me ask you all a question. I continued, standing up because sitting in that terrible chair was making my back hurt. If you know your friend's entire company started with money from a guy she's now trying to prenup into financial irrelevance, who exactly looks foolish in this scenario? Because from where I'm standing, it's not me. I walked to the door, done with this circus. Done with being interrogated by a committee of people who apparently thought having money while dressing like a normal person was some kind of moral failing. I turned back at the doorway, looking at Cassandra directly. You know what the funny thing is, Cass? I would have signed your prenup. Any version of it. I would have agreed to protect your assets, keep finances separate, whatever made you feel secure. But you didn't want a prenup for practical reasons. You wanted one to establish dominance, to make sure I knew my place in our financial hierarchy. And when it turned out there was no hierarchy, you couldn't handle it. That's not my fault. That's yours. Nobody said anything as I left. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up, the smooth jazz now sounding less like dental office music and more like the soundtrack to a relationship that was definitely over. The doorman gave me a sympathetic nod as I walked through the lobby, and I wondered how many similar scenes he'd witnessed in this building full of successful, complicated people with successful, complicated relationships. My phone buzzed before I even made it to my car. Gina, I'm hearing rumors about tonight through the legal gossip mill. You okay? Define okay. I texted back. Fair point. Drinks tomorrow? You can tell me everything, and I'll tell you how we're going to make her lawyers cry. I smiled despite everything. Deal. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls, which seemed to be the magic number for dramatic situations in my life lately. 14 were from numbers I didn't recognize, probably reporters or nosy people who'd somehow gotten wind of the tech CEO's fiancé drama. 2 were from my actual mother asking if I was eating enough vegetables, and 1 was from a number I did recognize and had been dreading. Vivian Reeves, Cassandra's mother, the original corporate warrior princess who'd apparently given birth to a carbon copy of herself and then spent the next 30-some years molding her into an even more intense version. I'd met Vivian exactly 4 times over the course of my relationship with Cassandra, and each encounter had been like having tea with a very polite, very well-dressed shark who was constantly evaluating whether you were worth eating or just ignoring. She was one of those women who'd climbed the corporate ladder in the 80s when it was basically a vertical wall with broken glass at the top, and she had the battle scars and the attitude to prove it. She wore power suits like armor, spoke in perfectly constructed sentences that sounded like they'd been edited for publication, and had a handshake that could crush walnuts. I stared at her missed call for a solid minute, debating whether answering was worth the inevitable headache. Chairman Meow, who'd been sleeping on my chest and was not pleased about being disturbed by my morning phone-checking routine, meowed his disapproval and relocated to the other end of the bed. Smart cat. He knew trouble when he smelled it. The phone rang again. Same number. Vivian Reeves was not a woman who gave up easily, which I suppose is how you become a successful corporate executive and raise another successful corporate executive. I briefly considered letting it go to voicemail again, but something told me that would only make the eventual conversation worse. Might as well rip the Band-Aid off now. Hello. I answered, trying to sound like I hadn't just been debating whether to block her number. Marcus. Her voice came through the phone crisp and sharp, like she was conducting a business call rather than addressing her daughter's fiancé. Not, good morning. Not, how are you? Just my name like an accusation. We need to talk about what you've done to my daughter. I sat up in bed, disturbing Chairman Meow further, who gave me a look that suggested our friendship was hanging by a thread. Good morning to you too, Mrs. Reeves. I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. How's the weather in Connecticut? There was a pause, the kind that happens when someone isn't used to being met with sarcasm and needs a moment to recalibrate. This is not a social call, Marcus. Cassandra called me last night, extremely upset. She told me about your financial revelation. My financial revelation, I repeated, getting out of bed and shuffling toward the kitchen, because if I was going to have this conversation, I needed coffee. Strong coffee. Possibly intravenous coffee. You mean the part where I turned out to have money? Yeah, that was quite a shock for everyone. Really threw a wrench in the whole narrative. Don't be flippant, Vivian snapped, and I could practically see her sitting in whatever pristine home office she probably had, probably wearing a suit even though it was Saturday morning. You humiliated my daughter in front of her legal team. You made her look foolish. I started the coffee maker, a basic Mr. Coffee that I'd owned since college and that Cassandra had repeatedly suggested I upgrade, and leaned against the counter. Mrs. Reeves, with all due respect, I didn't make Cassandra look anything. She made assumptions about my financial situation based on superficial observations, and those assumptions turned out to be incorrect. That's not humiliation I caused. That's reality she failed to investigate. You must understand the pressure she's under, Vivian continued, and her tone shifted slightly, becoming less accusatory and more explanatory, like she was trying to make me understand something fundamental about the universe. Cassandra has worked incredibly hard to build her company, to establish herself in a male-dominated industry, to prove that she's capable of competing at the highest levels. Image matters, Marcus. Perception matters. The story of her relationship, of being the primary breadwinner, of being strong and independent. Let me stop you right there, I interrupted, pouring coffee into my favorite mug, the one with a cartoon cat that said, I do what I want, that my sister had given me as a joke gift 3 Christmases ago. Are you seriously telling me that Cassandra's feminist empowerment narrative requires me to actually be less successful than her? That her story of being strong and independent only works if I'm weak and dependent? Because if that's the case, that's not empowerment. That's just a different kind of hierarchy with her on top. Another pause. I could hear her breathing, controlled and measured, probably counting to 10 the way executives do when they're managing their anger in professional settings. You're deliberately missing the point, she finally said. No, I think I'm hitting it dead center. I replied, taking a sip of coffee that was still too hot and burned my tongue, which felt appropriate for this conversation. The point is that Cassandra wanted to be seen as the successful one in this relationship, and I let her have that because I didn't care about the spotlight. But the moment she tried to legally codify that hierarchy with a prenup designed to protect her from me, like I was some kind of financial threat, she opened the door to actual financial transparency. And now she's mad that the truth doesn't match her preferred narrative. That's not my problem to fix. It becomes your problem when it affects her career, Vivian shot back. Her board is already asking questions. Investors are curious about her judgment. If she can't accurately assess her own fiancé's financial position, What does that say about her business acumen? I laughed, actually laughed out loud, which probably wasn't the diplomatic response, but was definitely the honest one. Oh, so now it's my fault that her board is questioning her judgment? Maybe they should be questioning why she demanded a prenup without doing basic due diligence on her fiancé's finances. That seems like a pretty significant oversight for someone whose whole brand is being thorough and strategic. You should have let her feel like the provider, Vivian said, and there was something in her voice now that sounded almost desperate. You should have understood that she needed that role, that identity. Why couldn't you just let her have it? And there it was. The real issue, stripped of all the corporate speak and the concern about image and reputation. Cassandra's mother, the woman who'd built her own empire and raised her daughter to do the same, genuinely believed that Cassandra's success required someone else to be less successful, that her daughter's strength required someone else to be weak, that her achievement required someone else to be lesser. Ma'am, I said, and I tried to keep my voice level and respectful because despite everything, I didn't actually hate Vivian, I just fundamentally disagreed with her worldview. I let Cassandra pay for dinner exactly twice in our entire relationship. Both times she insisted, both times she made a show of it, and both times I said thank you and moved on. I never fought her on it, never made her feel bad about it, never tried to assert my own financial dominance. I was perfectly happy letting her feel however she wanted to feel about money. But the moment she decided my financial position was a legal liability that needed protection against, she made it relevant. You can't demand financial transparency through a legal document and then get mad when that transparency reveals information you didn't expect. You're being unreasonable, Vivian said, but it sounded half-hearted now, like she was saying it out of obligation rather than conviction. I'm being honest, I corrected. There's a difference. She hung up without saying goodbye, which was probably the most honest thing either of us had done in the conversation. I stood in my kitchen in my pajama pants and old t-shirt, drinking mediocre coffee and wondering how I'd ended up in a situation where having money and not announcing it was somehow a character flaw. My phone buzzed with a text from Gina. Please tell me you didn't answer Vivian's call. Of course I did. I texted back. I live for chaos. You're an idiot, she replied. A wealthy idiot, but still an idiot. I'd barely finished my coffee when there was a knock at my door. Not a gentle knock, not an "I'm here to borrow sugar" knock, but an aggressive, demanding knock that made Chairman Meow bolt from the bedroom like his tail was on fire. I looked through the peephole and saw exactly what I'd been afraid of seeing. Vivian Reeves in a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, standing next to Cassandra, who looked like she'd gotten about 3 hours of sleep and had spent most of those crying. I briefly considered pretending I wasn't home, but my car was in its designated parking spot, and they'd probably already seen it. Also, I'd already answered Vivian's call, so playing hide-and-seek now seemed pointless. I opened the door, still in my pajamas, still holding my coffee mug with the cartoon cat, still very much not prepared for whatever intervention this was about to be. "Ladies," I said, blocking the doorway. "This is unexpected." "We need to talk," Vivian said, and it wasn't a request. "May we come in?" I looked at Cassandra, who couldn't quite meet my eyes, then back at Vivian, who was staring at me with the intensity of someone conducting a hostile takeover. "Do I have a choice?" I asked. "You always have a choice, Marcus," Vivian said. "But some choices are better than others." I stepped aside and let them in, immediately regretting every decision that had led to this moment. They entered my modest apartment like queens surveying conquered territory, taking in my IKEA furniture and my basic kitchen appliances and my general aesthetic of functional adult on a budget who secretly has millions in the bank. Vivian got straight to the point, standing in my living room like she was about to deliver a keynote speech. "Marcus, appearances matter in Cassandra's world. They matter to her career, her reputation, her future success. What people think about her personal life directly impacts her professional opportunities. Surely you can understand that." I sat down in my favorite chair, the one with the worn cushion that had molded to my body over years of use. "What I understand," I said slowly, "is that you want me to pretend to be less successful than I am so your daughter can maintain a narrative that makes her feel powerful. And I'm saying no. That's not," Cassandra started, but her mother held up a hand and she immediately stopped talking, which told me everything I needed to know about their relationship dynamic. Think of it as a partnership decision, Vivian continued, her tone shifting to the one she probably used in boardrooms when she was negotiating deals. For the good of Cassandra's career, for the stability of her public image, it would be beneficial if the financial disparity wasn't public knowledge. I looked at Cassandra. Is this really what you want? For me to hide who I am, what I've achieved, so you can keep pretending you're the only successful one in this relationship? She finally met my eyes, and for just a second, I saw something that might have been doubt or regret or maybe just exhaustion. But then Vivian shifted slightly, and whatever I'd seen disappeared behind the corporate mask. I just want things to go back to normal, Cassandra said quietly. They can't, I replied, because normal was based on incomplete information. This is the actual normal. The question is whether you can handle it. My neighbor from across the hall, Mr. Peterson, chose that moment to step out of his apartment for his morning jog, saw the scene through my open door, and actually clapped. Just started clapping like he'd been watching a performance and the finale had delivered. About damn time someone told them. He called out cheerfully, and then jogged off toward the stairs, leaving silence in his wake. Vivian's face was red. Cassandra looked mortified, and I was sitting in my worn armchair in my pajamas, still holding my cartoon cat coffee mug, thinking that maybe Mr. Peterson had the right idea about everything. 2 days after the mother-daughter invasion of my apartment, Gina called me laughing so hard she could barely breathe. I was at my desk pretending to work on a consulting project, mostly just scrolling through basketball highlights and wondering if my relationship drama would ever end, when her name flashed on my screen. "You're going to absolutely love this," she gasped between laughs that sounded borderline hysterical. "I just got an email from Dalton, her lawyer. You won't believe what they're proposing now." I leaned back in my chair, already grinning because anything that made Gina laugh this hard was guaranteed entertainment. "Hit me with it." "They want you to sign an NDA," she said, and then dissolved into more laughter. "About your own wealth. They want you to legally agree not to discuss your financial position publicly." I nearly dropped my phone. Wait, what? She wants me to sign a non-disclosure agreement about having money. Exactly. Gina was clearly having the time of her life. To protect her image as the breadwinner. They're literally asking you to shut up about being rich so she can keep pretending she's the only successful one. We didn't make it to the wedding, which honestly surprised nobody who'd been paying attention to the dumpster fire our relationship had become. Cassandra ended things via a carefully crafted email that her PR team had obviously edited, full of phrases like incompatible life goals and divergent values that really just meant you had the audacity to be richer than me. She told everyone I'd pretended to be broke to manipulate her, which was hilarious considering I'd never once claimed to be broke. Her PR team pushed that story hard, painting me as some kind of con artist who deceived their poor, innocent CEO. The narrative spread through tech circles faster than a software bug, and for about a week, I was apparently the villain in someone else's story. Then a journalist did actual research, crazy concept, I know, and found the public filings showing I was a major investor in Cassandra's company's early funding round. The same company she'd just taken public. The empire she'd built had literally started with my money. When that story broke, her company's stock dipped 11% in one day. Months later, life was genuinely good. My royalties kept rolling in like clockwork, padding my bank account while I continued my deliberately average lifestyle. I finally upgraded from my beat-up SUV, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because the muffler had started sounding like a dying donkey having an existential crisis, and even I have limits. Then I met Amelia at a coffee shop, an elementary school teacher who thought liquid assets meant the water fountain in her classroom, and portfolio diversification sounded like something from a sci-fi movie. Over coffee that cost $3 instead of $12, I told her the whole Cassandra saga. She laughed until tears streamed down her face. "Imagine needing a legal team just to love someone," she said, wiping her eyes. I grinned. "Yeah, it's a very niche form of romance. Not recommended." Looking back, Cassandra didn't break my heart. She audited it. She wanted legal protection from me, but I was the one who'd needed protection from her pride and her need to be superior. Now I know, when someone says it's not about the money, it's always about the money. And honestly, I've never been happier signing nothing.